Hello there, and welcome to season 15 of the Bitcoin Takeover podcast. I am Vlad, and today we are doing a very special interview on live stream with Eric Voskuil, who is the maintainer of Libbitcoin, the author of Crypto Economics, which is one of the few Bitcoin books that I actually own and I'm proud to have read. And it has lots of answers, such as subjective inflation principle and lunar fallacy, which I think are very relevant today for anyone to read. You find the book in the description of this video if you're interested. And we're gonna talk about his work on Libbitcoin, some stuff about Bitcoin, as well as some questions that we have received in advance from joining. Did you hear that?
Yes, I did. It's a little broken up. It was fine up until just then. Yeah, it's still.
Maybe there's something wrong with my connection. Live
Seems a little better
streams can
now.
be glitchy.
It's a little, yeah, it's a little grainy, but your voice was cutting in and out before.
Okay, so there is at least silent lamp in the chat. If there's anything wrong with the audio, let me know. I'm gonna record separately on a local instance so that nothing gets lost. So, Eric Voskuil, tell me more about what's new with Libbitcoin. It seems like last year you had some sort of incident, and people really enjoy making fun of these alternative Bitcoin clients, and they say, oh, they should not exist and blah, 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 because they can cause accidental hard forks and stuff. What happened and what do you do these days?
That's it. So, yeah, I bet you didn't know that book could act as an invisibility cloak when you're on camera too. That was pretty cool. Just your hands showing on the screen. Uh, yeah, there you go. Boom, you're gone. See that? It's a special book. So what am I doing these days? I spent about the last 6 months or more moving across the country. I lived in the Seattle area, and I live more in the Boston area, New Hampshire. And got a house, bunch of stuff. So I'm now back into coding and engaging more on Twitter. The thing you were referring to that happened, actually, it's interesting. All started happening right when I was in the midst of my move, and the other guy that works full time on the Bitcoin was having his first baby, I think, on the same day. It was really an odd coincidence of timing, but yeah, basically, we got a couple of notes from somebody who was I know discovered that people had used Bitcoin-Explorer, which is a command line tool we write to generate seeds for live wallets. And in that discussion, we found out that they were never, able to determine how many really or who, but they had lost a lot of their own funds doing this, and had also disclosed to us that they hadn't read the documentation on the command. That was the only command they used. They used one command and never read what it did. They just assumed, based on its name, I guess. So the command generates a pseudo-random value, right? And it exists so that we can pipe it into other commands, because primary use of the tool is a developer tool. It's meant for learning about, understanding, and experimenting with Bitcoin, and it makes it very easy to pipe into other commands that do all kinds of stuff that require randomness. But if you're going to use the set of commands to, say, build a wallet, you really should provide your own seed, and not use a pseudo-random seed that we're providing. So the upshot of it was, we kind of accepted that people will, never read any document, even though there's only one page of documentation per command. People will never read it, and we should probably just remove the command. But the assertions that were made by the gentleman that wrote it up were not true. And all the people that wanted to chime in on Twitter about how, we were scammers and everything was also very far-fetched. So I spent some time along with team members to write up a response to the CVE that they had posted. And that is actually on the Libbitcoin. I don't know how you post a URL on this thing if you wanted to, but I can send it to you and you can figure it out if you want to post it for people. Because there's a lot of assertions and accusations made throughout that whole thing that happened last summer, and I just went through each of them and pointed out that they were just wrong. Wiki. So it's in the BX wiki. There's a link on the menu, CVE 2023 39910. So I'll just post that to you. And so we just took the time to go through, for history of what had happened. But basically, the upshot of it is, Libbitcoin started out as several different projects by Amir Taki and some other people, and one of them was called SX, which didn't really have a clearly defined name behind it, just SX. SX was a set of tools that had been developed for Libbitcoin developers to use internally themselves to experiment and to help them write the node and everything and to communicate with it. That was formalized into a command line tool called BX. And when we did all the rebranding, we got rid of the SpezMilo repository. That went back to Tom, who works on Electrum, to own, and we moved everything into the Libbitcoin repo, and we rebranded the project so there was no longer the SpezMilo expander or whatever they were called in the past. So BX was really the first Libbitcoin version of this tool. The previous one was not documented, and it had seeding built into all the commands. It would just grab the computer's seed, whatever the random engine pass through C++ randomness functions would provide, and that was, I felt, and other team members felt, pretty dangerous because these commands are just picking up randomness without necessarily people even knowing they're using randomness in ways that are pretty important to security. So all of those commands were modified to accept randomness on the command line. Nothing in Libbitcoin was taking randomness entropy from the computer, and that's because we don't trust the computer. And we consolidated all of those commands into one command called the seed command, which generated a number originally from the computer, which was in an older version of BX, just like the previous commands had done. But when we changed, I think it was the change when we went to version 3, we decided to stop using the computer's source of randomness. The documentation didn't change because we never trusted the computer's source of randomness. It was a pseudo-random number. We went to just seeding the thing with the clock and using the same basic wrappers around that. And so there was talk about how we kind of slipped this into Andreas's book and all that, which was nonsense, and we showed that. Andreas put a whole bunch of stuff about BX in the book for the first release, and I think he had started with XX and then transitioned to BX before the publication. So I went through the book and made the technical corrections to the book because of the interface changes that happened, and the actual content that they were saying that we slipped into the book was his content. We didn't. It was just that it got renamed. The page got renamed when it got renamed to BX, so it looked like a new page. It didn't bother to dig into the history enough to find out that it was a rename of a page that Andreas had written. We didn't slip it in there to get people to use it to seed their wallets. And Andreas had listed it under fairly enough under experimenting with Libbitcoin-Explorer, not making your own wallet, right? This was for experimentation, I think was the word he used. Anyway, so there's the idea was we did this to protect people from trusting the computer to provide random numbers because it's well documented and there's a long history of those things being deeply flawed and causing lots of money, even though they're still used by some implementations. They still rely on the computer source of entropy. And in the document I linked to you, that we quote right from the documentation and historical accounts of when these things have happened and how you can't rely on C++'s APIs to provide truly random numbers. So the use of a truly a cryptographically secure pseudo-random number generator over them is pointless because it's not trustworthy. So we never trusted it. We documented the behavior. We did it intentionally, and then somebody, sure enough, went along and didn't. Apparently, security researchers took their own or their customers' money and bound it to one of these seeds, and then lost some of it. Right? Somebody figured it out. It was, I think, they had reasoned out the reason this happened is because some of their wallet got attacked, some unrelated, due to a weak seed, and then somebody must have gone around and started looking at things like this and found something similar. And so sure enough, they probably scanned the chain and found some wallets that had used it, some that still had money, and drained them, which was not a difficult exercise. And so, the people who wrote it up didn't actually disclose publicly that it was their money, and they kind of seemed to have an axe to grind about it. And then, of course, Bitcoin Twitter jumped on, like, as you said, the fact that there's an alternative implementation. Well, in this case, we're not talking about an alternative implementation of Bitcoin. We're talking about developer tools for wallet builders, right? Those are not alternative implementations of Bitcoin. There's a lot of wallets out there. And nevertheless, because we do implement a full node and we're the oldest project to have implemented a full node, there are certainly corners of the community who won't even look critically at anything that said. They'll just throw out, that we're scammers or something, But that has nothing to do with consensus, nothing to do with, forking the chain, none of that. It's just somebody misused a random number tool.
Yeah, according to this link that you sent me, the entropy was decreased from the standard 256-bit to 32-bit, and therefore it was easier to brute force private keys. Why did this happen?
That's not accurate. What are you reading?
Okay, maybe I'm misreading. Okay, let me quote the source of this. According to Blockworks,
from the link I sent you?
So I searched for 32-bit, and there is a section.
Is it on the page I sent you?
Entropy equals random bytes 32 in brackets.
Is it from the page I sent you?
Yeah, on GitHub.
Okay.
Maybe I mispronounced everything. I said it wrongly.
No, I just trying to find out. I'm trying to get on the same page as you. What are you referring to?
It's on the else branch of if argc equals 2 and entropy equals random bytes 32.
Oh, you're looking at source code. Okay, so
let me share the screen for.
No, I have the line. I'm trying to figure out what you're asking. Oh, this is the HDC command. Okay. I'm trying to remember what the entropy. Okay, if there's not enough args, it throws back the usage information for you to explain how to use it. If there's 2 arguments, it'll treat one as a seed provided on the command line. Otherwise, it generates random bytes. I don't remember what the 32, what the parameter is. So what's your question?
Well, according to this article written by blockworks.co, it says if the tool relies on a real random number generator, wallet security could plummet from robust standards like 256-bit down to a mere 32-bit, the team said.
Okay, well, yeah,
but they don't quote it.
you're misinterpreting something here. That statement, while obviously true, has nothing to do with this line of code. That 32 is not bits, it's bytes. As the function says, random bytes. 32 bytes is 256 bits. Okay, so it's generating 256 bits of randomness, which is required for the HD private key generation, right? Entropy is 32 bytes being fed into the HD private key constructor there. So it's not a question of how many, bytes we're generating. It's a question of how the bytes are generated. The security really has nothing to do with the length of the bytes you have. It has to do with how they're generated. You could have a 5,000 byte or bit key, and it can be completely insecure. That's not what matters. What matters is that the bits that are generated in the key of sufficient length are truly randomly generated. And there is absolutely no guarantee whatsoever that the C++ API that had been used previously and that is used by some other implementations provides truly random numbers. And there have been cases which are documented in that link I gave you, even affecting Bitcoin, where the platform's random number generator was returning a constant, always the same value. It was that bad, right? Or returning numbers that were clearly not truly random. So as you can see on that early implementation of the command, there was an option to provide a hexadecimal stream of bytes that would bypass our production of the random values. But that reference is SX. That's as I told you, that was a previous implementation. It's not even the same product we're talking about. So that's how it used to be done. You could provide the hex, or we just pull it off the computer.
There's also a mention here in a chapter that's called feature or bug. Mm-hmm. And it says it seems certain, and Libbitcoin team accepts that the documentation was insufficient to prevent unintended use. Mm-hmm. However, this is a far cry from quote-unquote bad cryptography, which the technical write-up asserts based entirely on observations that the documentation is not redundant. Mm-hmm. So you're arguing here that it was not bad cryptography that was the fault.
No, it was the documentation was sufficient to tell people don't do this with with a live wallet. It wasn't read. The fact that it wasn't read, at least by these people and maybe some others, is itself evidence that it wasn't sufficient. Because I'm assuming what they're saying is true, that they lost money and that they didn't read the documentation. So given that, it seemed better just to eliminate it altogether. It's just one command. It's, I don't know, 20 lines of code, which basically forces people to provide on the command line for any command that needs entropy, even if they're just doing demos or exploration, they have to provide that themselves. So it's an annoyance, but it's not worth the, people misusing it as they obviously did. So we took the command out. So that's what the sentence there means. It's, clearly it wasn't sufficient if there's evidence that people did it. But it's not bad cryptography because it wasn't cryptography, right? It wasn't, it was documented to not be secure.
Yeah, it says also in the last section, which is called response. And once again, I guess people watching on YouTube can see this, people listening on Spotify, I'm sorry for you, you're gonna have to look this up. It's on GitHub under the Libbitcoin repository, and it's under Libbitcoin-Explorer /wiki/CV 2023-389910. And it says, as there is no way to ensure that a seeding command would not be misused, and one cannot be made cryptographically secure in software, the command has been removed. The convenience of a command that provides a properly formatted seed for the most common scenarios is lost, and there is no longer opportunity for its misuse. My question right now is, A lot of people claimed, at least, that they lost Bitcoin with this. But are you aware? Did you keep count of
No,
how
no,
much they claim to have lost?
the only claims of people that actually lost Bitcoin from this came from the people that wrote that it was documented in the vulnerability they wrote up, or there was an article they wrote that it was based on, and in there is references, and in private emails to me, which because they misrepresented them, I reproduced them in full between myself and the other Bitcoin sorry, between the other Bitcoin maintainer and them, and then to me they're reproduced in full, and they disclosed that they lost their own money. And I think some friends of theirs or some people they knew, it wasn't, I don't remember exactly. Nobody else that I know of had come forth and said they lost money. And actually, if you look at the email trail between us, we were very responsive, contrary to what they claimed. They were unwilling to consider, when we pointed them to the documentation, that it might have been used against documentation, and eventually disclosed that it was their money that they had lost, or potentially their customers. It wasn't clear, but that's why they started investigating it. So, they never claimed we were stealing people's money or anything like that. That came from Twitter. But the assertion that it was bad cryptography was based on the assumption that we just kind of didn't know what we were doing, and we used some weak cryptography. Anybody going through the write-up that we provided that explains the history of it shows that most of the assertions that they're making about what happened historically, the chain of events, are incorrect, and provide a very well-reasoned explanation for why we would not trust platform hardware and or firmware and or operating system and or C++ language. All of those things have to be trusted to generate a truly random number from the computer. We just don't do that. And we made a decision intentionally to not do it when we consolidated all of the internal random number generation into one command for BX, and not just BX, the entire Libbitcoin stack removed any internal random number generation to functions that accept it only as provided by the user. And this one command consolidated all that to a utility that would generate a number you could feed into the other commands when you were doing the things that we used to do in BX to demonstrate behavior. So, it's not a wallet. BX is not a wallet, and it's not a node, right? It's a set of developer command line tools. And if a developer grabs a tool and decides to put a material amount of money behind the only command he uses from that tool, and doesn't even read the 1 or 2 sentence documentation of the tool, which is readily available at both the command line and on the wiki, which is where we provide the documentation, then how much more can we do, right? So there were suggestions we rename the command to the insecure blah, 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 whatever command, right? Well, we figured it was better just to remove the command at that point. Because it's not insecure, it's secure, it's just not intended to provide true randomness. It does what it's supposed to do, which is, provide a
and I want to show you something which is a consequence of this event, maybe the most unfortunate one. You get people like Mr. Hodl here on Twitter. He says there's a reason why Bitcoin Core, formerly known as Bitcoin, is Bitcoin, as if there should be no alternative implementation.
Yeah. Well, again, unrelated, because this was a wallet, and there's lots of wallets that have had these kind of problems. It's not a wallet, it's a tool that you would use to generate a wallet, which is what somebody did, right? Having nothing to do with implementations of Bitcoin. And by saying that, as a consequence of this, what you're saying is there should be no other wallets, right? And it shows you how far somebody will go to stretch the idea of there's one true Bitcoin, right? By basically saying, well, somebody, for whatever reason, use this command, this developer command to make a wallet, and therefore there shouldn't be any other wallets or APIs. There should really just be Bitcoin Core, the only wallet. So imagine a world like that, right? Where there are no other wallets. There's just Bitcoin Core. Where do you think Bitcoin would be right now?
On exchanges, most likely.
So again, this had nothing to do with a node. There's no random number generation in Bitcoin nodes, right? We don't do that. Um, so you know, it's just an obvious example of how far somebody will go to try to discourage other node implementations. But there are other node implementations. Libbitcoin was the first, and there are others. None, including Libbitcoin, have been sufficiently performant, reliable, et cetera, to even make a dent in the kind of stranglehold that Bitcoin Core has on node operation. So it really isn't, it yet remains to be seen whether there will be other implementations in use on a widespread basis for things like, mining and home use wallets, et cetera. Kind of remains to be seen, because until they, ourselves included, until they, get to that point, there's really only one choice. But the reason is not, what people think it is. The reason is not because, these other implementations haven't been able to not fork. That's not the reason. The reason is it's a lot of work, and all the money that goes into Bitcoin development, like 99% of it goes into Bitcoin Core and core related things. And the people who funnel that money are very clear about that privately. So it's left to, if you want to have a community of competing developers, not everybody, say being funded by a Bitcoin Foundation or the like, which is, we've had before, and we're working towards that again. You want to have that openness. You need other communities of developers. Standards are built on competing implementations coming together and deciding what they're going to do. So if that's going to happen, it's left to people like me and others that have for a long time worked on these kind of things at smaller scale. But I'm patient, and I enjoy what I do. So and it's not, there's no permission required. So we'll keep doing what we like doing.
Yeah, speaking of the idea that there should be no other wallets, which seem to be implied by the statement of Mr. Huddle, check out Wasabi Wallet. You get it from wasabiwallet.io. The reason why you should get it is that you can mix your Bitcoins with those of hundreds of other users at the same time. It's pretty cool. You have these massive coin joins with hundreds of inputs, hundreds of outputs. The denominations are not equal, so you can't really trace the input to link it to an output. It's really cool. You get free remixes. So if you join a coin join, you can join as many other coin joins without paying coordination fee, just the fee to the miners. And also, what else is cool about it? You have this buy anything button. So if you think that once you coin join your Bitcoin, there's nothing you can do about it because exchanges will not take it, well, they made this integration with ShopInBit. You press the buy anything button, you communicate with a salesman, basically telling him what you want. You tell him what you want, where you want it delivered, and you pay with Bitcoin, and you're gonna have it delivered with the concierge service of ShopInBit. Get Wasabi Wallet today from wasabiwallet.io. And I'm gonna let you say what you wanted to say, Eric.
That was good how you slipped that in there. That's great. I mean, it's a good example, right? Like, why doesn't Bitcoin Core's wallet implement all this stuff? I mean, I'm sure part of it is just, there's too much stuff to do, right? It's a big market. But also there's the idea that maybe, some of their sponsors don't want coin joins in what they're paying for, right? Because it's dark market kind of stuff. And a lot of the money that's going into Bitcoin Core development is corporate money. And, we don't have those strings attached, so we do what we want, and neither do, other wallet, manufacturers. Maybe, I don't know anything about, the Wasabi funding or their business. So, but if you take this idea that if somebody say somebody writes a wallet and it's got a flaw in it and it causes people to lose money, therefore there's only one Bitcoin, it's Bitcoin Core, right? What does that mean? That means there shouldn't be any other wallets, and there wouldn't be your sponsors, right? They wouldn't exist if that was really how it went. And we would have now large scale corporate funding going into the only wallet. Personally, that's not what I'm here for. And not only that, the connection doesn't really make sense. Bitcoin Core has had material flaws, right? And shipped them and caused, havoc. And every single version that they ship and every single platform that it runs on means it's a different implementation, which means they introduce, all these risks as well. And the complexity of it is extraordinarily high by design, not by necessity. Some of it is necessity, but a lot of it's just by the design, which means that likelihood may even be higher in such implementations. And this is not a new idea. I didn't invent the consensus red herring idea, but that's used to try to prevent competition in the space. There was a hard fork involving Bitcoin Core that had nothing to do with even the software they were running. It was the dependencies underneath it. It's kind of people will do their best to defend their own interests, and they want to see their own project succeed. That's completely understandable, but it's a free market so far. And, competition will continue to produce, alternatives. Maybe there can only be one true implementation, but there's no reason it has to be Satoshi's prototype, right? Which we used to refer to as Bitcoin D before. The idea of core development, which was not limited to Bitcoin D, seems to have been rebranded down to Bitcoin Core. A little bit of a land grab there. But no, there's other people.
There was another Romanian guy who was crazier than me, and he was running his own client of Bitcoin.
I'm sorry?
You know Mircea, the trilemma guy. He was running his own implementation of Bitcoin at one point.
I don't know. I don't think I know him personally.
He supposedly died 3 years ago, but that's not the point.
Guy that passed away a few years ago was he Hungarian?
No, Romanian.
Well, I don't remember. He had done I did know him. I met him once in Hong Kong at Scaling, who had done an early Bitcoin alternative implementation and then sold it to somebody. But the name you said didn't ring a bell. And unfortunately, and he died a few years ago.
It's Mircea Popescu. Pretty sure you read his blog Trilemma at one point.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's just not I'm pretty sure that's not the name I'm thinking of. The thing you're talking about with the Trilemma, that was just a few days ago. I'm talking years ago, where I met him and I can't remember. Anyway, I can follow up before I can look it up.
The reason why I mentioned him is that he was running his own implementation, the one true Bitcoin. It was bitcoin.foundation or something, the URL for it. And you could download the client. He was the sole maintainer. And he was running some sort of cult right there with his own followers. Everyone had to use PGP. They would only communicate via IRC. It was very cypherpunk from this point of view.
Cool.
But he was able to be in consensus. That's what I'm trying to say. That he had his own stripped down version of Bitcoin. He didn't like SegWit. He didn't like a lot of stuff. But he was able to be in consensus with the rest of the network.
Yeah. Well, the Bitcoin version 3 runs. We have some people that just host servers and maintain a couple of them, our team, and the code's barely been changed in like 5 or 6 years. It's still the release version, and it's still running along, validating blocks. So as far as we can tell, it's in consensus and hasn't, and it didn't have the implementation of the inflation soft fork that Bitcoin Core shipped, and then unshipped. So yeah, I mean, seems to be possible to have a record that's long standing, but the fact that there have been implementation issues in Bitcoin D that have caused hard forks on the network, and I mean, a hard fork is not a split in the chain. So just to be clear, all right, a hard fork is a rule change that, or a rule change that invalidates that validates what would formerly have been an invalid block, as opposed to a soft fork, which invalidates what would have formerly been a valid block. That's a rule change. It's not a split in the chain. You could deploy the rule change and not see a split for a long time or ever. Or you could see a split immediately, depending on how effective. And there was a built-in kind of hard fork in Bitcoin D that was a consequence of switching to switching the database implementation. Had to do with how many locks could be held concurrently or something in it. I think bit 50 was written up around that, right? So it was just lurking there until blocks started getting bigger, and then boom, it blew up. And so it kind of randomly invalidated blocks that would have been previously, or that on other machines would have been considered valid based on sorry, not on other machines, in older implementations, right? And one of the resolution to that was to just put a restriction on block hashes, on the hashes within a block, and then later that restriction was lifted. So there's a bunch of forks that all happened as a consequence of this oversight that had to do with database locking when they shipped that version of the database. So these things happen even with a so-called single implementation, right? And that issue didn't happen with us, and neither did the inflation issue. So there's also the argument that the code is the consensus, right? Bitcoin D, whatever Bitcoin D ships is the consensus, but it can't be, because there were two, in the case of the database locking issue, level DB there were two concurrent, at least two concurrent implementations out there. So which one is it, right? And in the same implementation, there were two concurrent behaviors, or sorry, I might be confusing that with a different one. I'm not sure. I think the level DB issue was different on different platforms, but I might be confusing that with a different fork. But in any case, right, you ship because there was another issue relating to OpenSSL, and I think that was the one that was different on different platforms, depending on which version of OpenSSL you had. So different on different platforms, different on different, minor revisions. So where's the truth? When the inflation software came out, the code wasn't the truth. And to change it, right? So whatever bug you ship is not the truth. And that's an interesting thing. So the question is, what is the consensus? And people, if you just tell them it's the code and the code's too complex, you'll never understand it. People don't know what the consensus is, which I find really interesting. People are willing to accept that whatever these guys have done, they might do. They don't tell you that they've forked, but they did, which has happened several times. Soft forked, for example, or hard forked. So people just accept it, and because they can't see the rules, they can't understand them. At least that's the theory, and that's really not the truth. That's not the reality, but it requires a vastly different implementation to really help people see what the rules really are. And that's one of the things that we work on, is to try to isolate consensus, not just script, right? The idea of what's actually a rule and what's not in Bitcoin, and then explain these to people, like, why do these exist and what do they mean? But takes time. We'll get there.
That's actually an interesting point that I never considered before. Thinking about it, it makes a lot of sense. You have an alternative implementation of the same code base or a rewrite or something that's entirely new but respects the consensus codes, for the simple reason that you want it to be an oracle of truth, just in case there are changes that go by unnoticed with core. You're going to have this which tells you, you changed your rules, and this one doesn't follow the new rules because it didn't try to do any politics in the background. This is pure, it hasn't been changed. You said there's a version 3 of Libbitcoin, which has been running for 6 years and didn't deal with all of this politics and the idea of a modification in the client software, because there was an accidental inflation bug, which was, if I'm not mistaken, added there accidentally by Blue Matt.
Yeah.
I don't want to accuse him, but
No,
I
no, I mean,
think
it
he
happens.
took credit
That's
for
the
it.
point, is that it's going to happen to them too, right? That's no, this, all software has bugs, and everybody's committed bugs, but there was the problem with it is that there was this hype around this infallibility, which is nonsense, and it happened, right? Not just then. It's important for, that was an important data point for people to recognize. But it had that inflation bug turned into an actual chain split, right? Bitcoin Core, that version would have been on its chain, and Libbitcoin would have been on another fork, right? Because
Yep.
we weren't accepting the same blocks because we didn't have that flaw. And the flaw was, it was just a simple implementation detail. It was, the code reviewers didn't see it, whatever, but our implementation was different. We didn't even have that type of code in there. I mean, we did the same stuff, obviously, but we did it in a different way. So we didn't have the flaw because it wasn't in the original code. If there was a flaw in the original code, hopefully we've identified it and said, okay, we got to reduce this. We got to reproduce this weirdness that is actually consensus, that doesn't appear to be necessary or useful in any way, but it happens, so we have to reproduce it. There are cases of that. But in this case, it was just something new that was introduced, and we would have been chugging along. And the question is, who was on the real chain? So at the point that shipped, which implementation was Bitcoin? We were. They weren't, because they changed it back. So the code is not the consensus. And if something is lurking out there for years, like, I don't know how many years, how much time, but LevelDB or the OpenSSL issues, other issues, they're lurking out there for years, and then they become an issue and they get changed. They don't just keep them in the code. What does that tell you? The code is not the consensus. And those issues we didn't have either. And if, we just keep chugging along on the code that on the original chain. So, and there are some cases where LevelDB one is kind of confounding because it was kind of random, right? You didn't know which behavior you're going to get. So they made it kind of not random by imposing a strict limit, reduction in the number of locks that the database could take with the very quick issuance of a consensus patch. But an example of a consensus rule that makes no sense is there's a number of them to me that make no sense. They don't contribute economically, security, anything like that. They're just in there. But this one is objectively, and by anybody's perspective, really should make no sense, which is the ordering of transactions in a block. The order that the transactions occur within the block don't matter. But they do matter because of the way Satoshi wrote the loop that evaluates inputs versus outputs, right? You read the first transaction, you read the outputs of that transaction, and you put them in a stack somewhere, right? And then you read the next transaction, you read the inputs. The first transactions with inputs could only refer, is Genesis, right? So there's no inputs, but then you go to second transaction, its inputs could refer to the previous transaction's inputs, right? Or another block's inputs. So you're putting outputs on the stack, and then you're reading the next one, and you're reading inputs off of that stack. And then you're reading against the entire chain, the history, right? So what that means is that if you have a transaction in that block that is listed in order after one that spends its outputs, it's not valid. Even though it's perfectly reasonable, there's no reason you would need to order them in that way. And the ordering is not a total ordering, right? There's still many ways you could order these transactions and still have the outputs come before any input that spends them in the block. So it's not like it's clean or neat. It's not a total ordering. It doesn't always have to be the same. There's a lot of ways you could do it. You just gotta have the inputs before the outputs chronologically. Well, what that does in terms of implementation, I'm sure Satoshi, didn't even probably care that much. There's no reason to care really, but it looked more efficient because you can do these things in order, boom, 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 right? You stack them up as you go, and then you pop them off as they're spent. But if you have thousands of transactions in a block and you want to concurrently validate those transactions, you wouldn't do it the way he did it. You would do it in parallel, where you might pull off all the previous outputs. You might store that. All those transactions are probably already stored in your database. So all the previous outputs are in the database. They've been coming in as mempool transactions or transaction pool transactions. Then you get the block header shows up and you go to validate the block. And what do you want to do? You just want to look up all the previous outputs, including ones for that block, and you do it in parallel across the 5,000 transactions in the block. Okay, so you can't just do that because there's this consensus rule that says they got to be in a certain order. So what do? We separate that consensus rule from the obtaining of the previous outputs. We actually have a rule that says, no forward references. So there can't be in a given block. We just scan the block to see if any input refers to an output that didn't come previous in listed order to it. Right? That's just a rule. Why is it there? Does it contribute to the economic health of Bitcoin? Does it contribute to the security of Bitcoin? Absolutely not. Not in any way. But it's a consensus rule, and it's freaking stupid. But it's in there. And there's a few things and there's other things that look like they're in there because they're denial of service protection, but they're not. Right? They don't help you protect yourself against DOS. They don't protect the chain from what people call spam, right? They just don't. Interesting rules like the Coinbase has to be first. Why? There's no security or other reason for that. There can only be one Coinbase. Why? No reason. There's a lot of interesting little rules in there that just they just get listed in. Yeah, this is just implementation cruft that goes back to Satoshi. They're not there for any economic reason or security reason. So then if you take all that out, you set it aside. Okay, you got to do this because you got to stay in consensus. But these are the things that actually matter economically, and they pretty much just come down to inflation, right? That's what the rules are. At least the non-script rules. Sorry, I'm rambling on. I could told you before. I can go on forever about this stuff. It's fun.
Yeah. I have a follow-up question, which is based on something that I found on Twitter, and I think it's useful to address just for the sake of being open and honest, because people are going to listen to this interview and say I went soft on an issue which they magnify as being bigger. But before that, I have to read something which I received from Paul Stortz. He said, is Blockstream going downstream? Has RGB getting you down and brown and ground? After a long day of listening to Peter McRetard, why not feel something for a change? Feel alive. Join Layer 2 Labs and make everyone feel sad and frustrated and angry. Our next ritual is at 3 a.m. in the ancient forest. See you there. I'm Paul Stortz and I approve this message. Or do I?
I know Paul, and I don't really know what to make of the message. What was your question around that?
There's no question around that. I'm gonna go to the question right now. So I've opened this Twitter client, and there's this guy, Tadjid Drija. I'm not sure, Drija.
Yeah, Taj is a long-term core Bitcoin developer.
So after any incident, there will be people attempting to perform character assassination to a degree and paint you as either incompetent or malevolent and claim that they don't know which one you are.
Yeah.
And he said basically that you used head, this, how should I read it? head-c32/dev/urandom.
Yeah.
SHA-256 sum, used it interchangeably with date plus S%N.
Okay, so these are not things that he's claiming we actually did. He's saying that we think they would be the same because he's drawing an equivalence between the implementation choices we made and doing something like simple like this on the command line. Of course, it doesn't imply that we think they're the same thing. It implies that somebody didn't read the documentation, that that the latter is what we're doing, and therefore you should not use this for your wallet. That's a distinction he's not willing to try to make, because obviously he has some reason to assume we're evil, right? And then he throws in the MT19 19937, which is a Mersenne twister algorithm. And Mersenne twister algorithm is not a cryptographically secure pseudorandom number generator. And so he's thinking that we use the Mersenne twister because we thought it would make it more secure than just using, say, the date. That's not the case. The Mersenne twister is just used to stretch the date into a longer value. I think that was the only reason it was used. And ironically, it was, I think, in an operating system implementation of what people, maybe him in this case, assume is truly randomly secure. I think it was no, I think it was MinGW. Well, MinGW is a Windows subsystem that Linux users can use to compile for Windows. And Bitcoin Core, I believe, compiles on MinGW. And I think if you look in my write-up, there's an example where MinGW uses a constant, I think, pumped through a Mersenne twister to provide the random number generator that he's suggesting was secure, right? Which is ridiculous when you think about it, right? So the point is that the comparison he made between the supposedly secure and the not secure is a nonsensical comparison. They're both not secure, and that's why we documented it and implemented it that way. But will you get the benefit of that doubt from your competitors? No.
And then you get some mean comments like, oh, is it the same as the ETH vanity address generator? And this guy saying, oh, Eric Voskuil makes sense.
Yeah. Basically, anybody that's had an axe to grind in the past, or just wants to virtue signal there with. I mean, Todd just is a well-known and respectable core developer. So if he says something, people aren't going to question it. People. How many people there do you think actually understand the technical details of this? Nobody, right? So I was actually pretty shocked, because I've always seen him as a pretty reasonable guy, and we've met before. I think we were on a panel together in El Salvador, and there was no hostility there that I could sense. But people certainly jump at the attempts to jump at any opportunity to go after a alternative implementation, even though this was not a node.
You think that this is sort of personal, and people see Libbitcoin as a threat that's draining funding that they could be getting instead?
Okay, well, I mean, personal in terms of my person, I don't think so. I don't think any of these people, that at least the ones that I know and the core developers, I don't think they're after me, right? Maybe some on Twitter people I've debated with or whatever, they might not like me. There's I have a couple trolls, but I think if something like this, right, happened in Bitcoin Core wallet, right, or say we shipped an inflation bug, right? If we shipped an inflation bug and somebody noticed it, right, in the production release of Libbitcoin, the node, how do you think the reaction would go? Right, when they shipped an inflation bug, all kinds of stuff, right? I mean, they were, eventually kind of came right out and say eventually, I think pretty quickly came out and disclosed it and whatever. But, this is sus, this is intentional. These guys are, no, I mean, obviously it's a different scenario, but the treatment is vastly different. People who are pumping money into an implementation, who spent years becoming experts on the implementation, who have pinned everything to the implementation, who've made, grand comments about how it's the only one that could possibly be secure or whatever. They minimize their own flaws, and they do everything they can to amplify what they see as the flaws in other implementations. Even in this case, where it had nothing to do with the node, and it was documented behavior. And they didn't even look critically at it, right? Didn't wait for any input from us. After I wrote up that article explaining everything that happened, I posted out through Twitter. You could probably find it if you wanted to. There were like 3 supportive, 4 or 5 supportive comments from people that kind of, they know the Bitcoin, and nothing, complete silence from everybody else, because maybe they actually read it. There not a single comment, disputing anything we said. So it's just how it is. I didn't go around whining about it, right? I spoke up so that people wouldn't think, I was hiding from something, or that, the team didn't know what we were doing. Yeah, we knew what we were doing. And in this case anyway, we may not always, but I spoke up to set the record straight. But I expect this kind of stuff. This is the path that Amir chose and that we chose. Amir started Libbitcoin because Bitcoin D was operating a very closed environment that, they actually kicked Amir off the security mailing list because I guess he was too erratic or something. And Amir, if you know Amir, he can ruffle people's feathers, and maybe, they didn't like to see that. But they also had, the Bitcoin Foundation was funding Bitcoin development at that time, the core developers. Bitcoin Foundation was, a corporate consortium. Now, I guess it still exists, but over the years following Amir kind of creating the BIP system to open up what they were doing, and creating Libbitcoin to provide an alternative implementation of it, and kind of sounding the bell against what was happening in core development over a period of years, not too many years, it completely collapsed, and people won't have they don't want it. Everybody pretends they had nothing to do with the Bitcoin Foundation. So was he right to do that? Did it make sense? Yeah, I think so. And that's the path that Libbitcoin has always been on, and other developers for other platforms have been supportive from that perspective. Never remember the guy's name. Okay, hold on a second. They never met him. Yeah, Dave Collins. I don't know if he works on BTCD right now or not. I don't think I've ever met him. Anyway, he wrote a topic called the Bitcoin Consensus Red Herring in 2015. It's still out there. I'll send it to you. So this wasn't from Libbitcoin. It was from another developer of alternative implementations. And he made all the points that I'm making now. There really aren't any new points. But there's been more stuff, like say the inflation bug and stuff that's happened since he wrote this. So it's not new. Anybody that chooses this path is kind of on their own. The corporate money that goes into, there's groups like Brink, for example, who's funneling money into what they say is open source Bitcoin development. That's what they say publicly on their website. Brink is, financed by the big money types in Bitcoin, right? I don't know. Won't name any names. You can find it on their website, but they will explicitly tell people who aren't working on Bitcoin Core that they don't fund that. It's not in their mandate, and so even if they like the project, and so to me, that and other things that are similar to it start to sound an awful lot like the Bitcoin Foundation, where you've got corporate money that needs certain things done in core development, or wants certain things done in core development, or just wants their own node to be maintained properly. They're funneling money into that through a nonprofit that pretends to be supporting the whole community. Then they're not. So that's it's coming back around to the same thing. I'm not saying it's the same. It's maybe not quite there yet. Maybe it's more diverse, but the Bitcoin core group likes to see themselves as the entire community. If you're not in that community, you're not part of the consensus, right? So so they can maybe these corporate sponsors can see themselves as contributing to open source Bitcoin development if they direct everything to one group, but it's a very well-funded group to, just compared to others, right? That get pretty much all the corporate funding. So like I said, we chose that. I'm not gonna complain about everybody coming after alternative implementations when there's something goes wrong, and nobody going after core when when something goes wrong there. I expect it, and we just do the best we can and keep moving forward.
Yeah, I think at this point we have a very nice transition into the questions that we received, because very recently you watched the presentation from Bitcoin Atlantis by Michael Saylor. As you said to me before we started recording this, it was the first time you actually listened to the guy. And after spending 10 minutes, you wrote a lot of tweets explaining why some of his, by his, I mean Michael Saylor's takes are terrible. And he's presenting some metaphors, and his core argument is that of submitting to KYC compliant institutions and forgetting about the cypherpunk roots for the sake of a general good that's number go up. And I think we can start talking about that, because it's like a clash between generations of Bitcoiners. You have been maintaining Libbitcoin for 10 years, possibly have been involved in Bitcoin for longer. And this guy came along in 2020. Since day one, he said, forget about the cypherpunk ideology, forget about privacy, forget about that shit. This is supposed to be digital gold and nothing else. And we're gonna institutionalize it, we're gonna promote it to corporations, we're gonna run ETFs, we're gonna try to regulate mining in North America to make it ESG compliant because Elon says so, and whatever. So what was your reaction, honestly, when you watched that?
So yeah, again, I didn't watch the whole thing. I watched enough, so I kind of got tired of watching it. None of it surprised me. And I'm not like, you follow this little tweet storm that happened as a result of me making one or two tweets about it, which were really just poking fun at some of the metaphors that he uses. Because first of all, they're unoriginal, right? I've been poking fun at these for a long time. They're kind of silly. He didn't invent them, right? But he's, and so what was my reasoning for doing that? I mean, a lot of people use stupid metaphors to make, but he's become very influential, and he in this presentation, for example, he's doing those things that you suggest. He's trying to get people to forget about the cypherpunks and all those ne'er-do-wells, who are trying to make this black market money, because if we can get the state on board, the number's going to go up. And that's really what matters, right? Because he's, as far as I can tell, he made a big bet on a failed company to save it. And, I mean, I say failed loosely. I don't really know anything about it, but I looked at the stock history going back to, I guess, when they went public, and it was flat for 22 years. That's a catastrophe when it comes to, a tech company. So, okay, now he's a hero, right? And I don't know if you followed on that thread, but I did make some people were like, well, no, you could do better, right? I'm like, well, wait a minute. I founded my first company in 98, the same year that stock thing, whatever, takes off, right? And sold it to Microsoft, founded another company, which is still out there. It's called Beyond Trust. It's very big now. And I'm out of it, but I did another one that didn't succeed, and then I found Bitcoin a decade, ago, like quite a bit before him. Now, if he had just done nothing but put his money in the Nasdaq, I think is what I said. I think the total internal rate of return for the Nasdaq over that 22-year period up until today is around 1,000%. He would have exceeded his returns even today with the Bitcoin he's purchased with this company. I put up the graphs right on top of each other, just price history, Bitcoin and the Nasdaq, and that's only 500% returns. If you take total internal rate of return, it's almost double that. So okay, so I retired before Satoshi did. I think I said that. I realized that today. Like I've done this stuff. I started. They weren't as big, right? But percentage wise, I started and ran a couple of tech companies that were very successful, and I was able to retire, and now I do what I want. And that was around the time I found Bitcoin. That's when I stopped working on that stuff. So yeah, I do have some perspective on this. I know what it's like. When I left Beyond Trust, I think I was the CTO. We were about to go public when 2008 changed everything. It was about a 150 person company. I don't know, if it's MicroStrategy around the same time frame, but I do have some perspective on this stuff, and I have some experience. So I'm not enthralled by this personality. I just don't care, right? Yeah, he's made a big bet and it's paying off for him. It probably will pay off for him, but he could have gone to Vegas and put it all on red. It might have paid off and he might have been a hero, right? So the point is that there's been a shift, I think, that you've pointed out several times recently, that has happened over the years, where it's just become more and more about number go up, price, narratives, and less about stateless money. And one of the things that maybe he doesn't understand, maybe people who follow him don't understand. So the problem with like a narrative or I call them cheerleaders, right? The Bitcoin cheerleaders, is they dumb down the conversation to the point where people aren't really thinking about it. They're just repeating the narrative, right? So they don't like. I love Andreas, and he was very early getting Bitcoin out there to people, and everybody been around for a while knows that, right? And we owe him a lot of the debt of gratitude. But some of the techniques he used to push Bitcoin became the standard narrative for Bitcoin. And I don't even know if he originated them, but basically the fact that that it's the technology, or the idea that it's the technology that secures it, right? So it can't be stopped. There's no way states could could stop it. It's just you can't change my consensus rules on my machine. You can't get enough hash power to attack the chain. You can't tax it. You can't print it, right? And so people have accepted that and they move on, and then they encounter somebody like Saylor who says, let the KYC people come, let these regulators come, and it's going to create more and more and more adoption, which is going to, obviously we care about that because the number is going to go up and we're going to reach more people and make it all better for them. So if you've accepted, on the one hand, it's secure by design, right? The technology itself makes it this way. Then you can accept, on the other hand, that we can just let these guys, come in and create their white market edifice, around this system, and we'll still be, the cypherpunks. We'll still be able to save people in Venezuela who can't buy medicine because they can't transfer money in and out of the country, or you name it, around the world. So I went to Zimbabwe and a bunch of countries in Africa. I've been Latin America and South America. I've been to 90 countries. I travel a lot, and I talk to people about these things. And I don't really give a shit about somebody in fucking New York making money on Bitcoin. What I care about is people being able to survive because they can move their money around without getting caught, by their dictatorship, and the rebels in Myanmar who are trying to throw off their military junta right now, that overthrew their new democracy, the new republic, right? Out there 3D printing guns in the jungle and maybe using Bitcoin to get the money to do it. So, number go up is not why I'm here. And unfortunately, it's the narratives that people spew out that are just intended to shut people up and make them dumb, right? Bitcoin's a store of energy. No, it's not. It's fucking dumb, right? It's just a money like every other money. It doesn't store anything but itself. You put some dollars in a box, you get them out. What did you store? You stored the dollars. You didn't store the value. You didn't store energy. You put some Bitcoin, in your wallet. What did you store? You stored Bitcoin. What does that mean? It means you stored Bitcoin. And if somebody wants to give you something when it comes out, good on you, right? But the idea that it's storing energy and maybe that wallet can then power your lawnmower is obviously just a metaphor. And so people pointed out, hey, it's just a metaphor. I'm like, well, yeah, no shit, it's a metaphor. I'm poking fun at the metaphor because he's saying it like it's real, first of all. And many people actually believe it's real. If you followed any of those conversations that that followed from that, I was just like, it was batshit crazy. People actually believe we're sending energy, say from Alaska, I think to Zurich was the one discussion we had, so people could charge their Teslas by sending Bitcoin to them. I'm like, remember I don't know if you saw it, but like, okay, let's assume 100% of all the world's energy is produced in Alaska. And all we have is, a satellite link to Europe, and some guy in Zurich needs to charge his car, but the only electricity is in Alaska. We send him some Bitcoin, he can charge his freaking car. And the guy's defending it tooth and nail. I'm like, come on, you got to realize this is not real, right? Alaska, the energy is still in Alaska. It's not charging your car in Europe. Bitcoin's not going to do it. So, okay, stupid narrative. It's a metaphor. Well, no kidding. It's a metaphor. But what does it mean if it's just a metaphor? It doesn't mean anything. It means Bitcoin's like every other money. You can use energy to get it, and you can sell it to buy energy and everything else. Okay, so it's not what makes Bitcoin special. And if that's not it, then what is it? Right? If we're all cheering, it's stored energy and nothing else can store energy. And I go, it's a fucking bullshit. And everything else is the same, right? I'm like, it's not a differentiator. That's the point. Right. And there was hundreds of people, maybe more, who came up and said, don't you realize it's just a metaphor? I'm like, yeah, do you realize I've been working on this stuff for a decade? Right? No, it's a fucking metaphor. So if you believe that these are the kind of things that make it valuable, that make it securable, you might buy into the bullshit about making it a white market money that backs the economy. That's called the Bitcoin standard, by the way. Right. And that was Hal Finney's idea, right? He might not have even been the first, but he was pretty early. And Saifedean picked it up and put it in his book. And what's really interesting is when I was working in Bitcoin, and I'm like, I kept seeing all these tweets coming from this guy, Saifedean. I'm like, but he was just showing up, and I'm like, what's this stuff he's saying? It's not making a lot of sense. And where's he coming from? What does he do? Okay, so it was, he hadn't disclosed it yet, but he was working on a book. And so I started critiquing some of the things he was saying. And I remember very clearly these things that he was saying. And one of them, I can only paraphrase it. I don't think it exists. I mean, I think he deleted a bunch of this stuff from the early days. But what he said was basically Hal Finney, right? It was we have this vast financial system around the world. It's so big, we're never going to freaking change it, right? We got credit cards, we got banks, we got all this stuff. But to fix it, what we can do is we can take Bitcoin and we can slide it underneath, right? Like we had with gold. And I don't know if you remember, but the Baltic Honey Badger presentation where he talked about how the way government could defeat Bitcoin was to basically go back to the gold standard. That's the mentality, right? The gold standard is kind of the Austrian native mentality. So he's thinking about this like it's the new gold standard, right? The Bitcoin standard. And what standard means is a exchange ratio that is fixed. Right? That's what a monetary standard is. The standard conversion between gold and dollars is, $33 an ounce or something like that, right? So that's what the gold standard was. That's what he meant by the Bitcoin standard. And I started critiquing this, and I'm like, there's really no security there. And so this led to a number of the chapters in my book, because I kept having to write these things over and over and over again because people were starting to embrace these ideas. And I'm like, this. So I give him credit for causing me to write a bunch of stuff. I wasn't trying to write a book. I was just blogging these things. Then I think probably in order to try to shut me up, he said, well, he said he's writing a book and I should review it, right? So he sent me a copy of it as a Word document before it went to publication. Apparently, I'm assuming it wasn't public, right? And so I reviewed it. I was working on it a little bit at a time, and I sent him some stuff, and we still had some back and forth on Twitter, and he blocked me. Been blocked ever since, right? So that's my perspective on one of the other big narrative pumpers, which resulted in things like stock to flow and time preference inversion, all kinds of other nonsense that pervades the Bitcoin community, right? And now you get Saylor picking it up, and it's all this non-Bitcoin stuff, and it's based on flawed fundamental ideas that when it comes to economics, this stuff gets really technical. It's like Bitcoin implementation, but I spent decades studying economics, and um, popularity is not a measure of, of correctness. When it comes to Saylor, when it comes to, other economics. And so I've had, to me, I'm not trying to fill stadiums or, even really make money. I'm just doing what I like. And I've always liked teaching people things, and I like making things. And I like technology, I like business, I like investment, I like security. I'm an ex-military guy. I have all these, different interests. And when I see something that like I can contribute to, like on Twitter or whatever is where I do most of my engagement, or I go to a conference, I talk about it, and I try to get people to understand the truth of certain things, and not just kind of spit out narratives, right? Like lower your time preference. Okay, it sells books, but it's a dumbass statement. It just doesn't make any sense. And the idea that
You know what
people
that means in reality? Lower your time preference. It says,
do things you don't want to do, I
if
guess.
you wait long enough, I'm gonna prove you that I'm right. That's what it means usually.
Well, I mean, I don't know how people interpret it, right? But the idea of, so first of all, in economics, value is subjective. Economics provides zero, and I'm talking about, kind of pure Austrian economics, Rothbard, Mises, Menger, right? Economics makes no assumptions about what's in somebody's head. It is not psychology. And Rothbard is explicit about it. He actually says this is not psychology, right? We don't know what is in anybody's head. This is it's an axiomatic system. It's based on a series of assumptions. And from that, we derive conclusions. But one of those assumptions,
That's what we call praxeology, right?
yeah, I just don't like the term,
action.
but I just use rational economics, right? It's rational in that it's derived from, it's like geometry. You got a set of assumptions, you take those assumptions, you derive conclusions. Praxeology, Austrian economics. The problem is that those terms have been around long enough. They're spread much more broadly than that now. So I just use the term rational economics. Maybe I'll write it down someday. But it's in the original Menger vein, and Rothbard's Man, Economy, and the State does a pretty good job of staying consistent to that. Not entirely, but it's pretty good. And it's easier to read than Mises. It's really just an archaic version of Rothbard was hired to update Mises to make it more current. Does a good job of it, and even introduces some of his own stuff. But Man, Economy, and the State is the only work by Rothbard that I would ever recommend. Some of the other stuff is just it's too light for people to get something useful out of. They get exactly the opposite of what they should be getting out of it sometimes, and they never. I mean, Man, Economy, and the State with Power and Market is a tome. It's right, and Power and Market wasn't even published when he published Man. It was one book originally, right? He was hired to as I understand, he was hired to update Mises. He writes this massive book. It's detailed, it's thorough, and it's rigorous. And it's not like his other books, which are much more casual. And he makes very few logical errors in it. Although, a couple of times he deviates from the axiomatic kind of system. And I think there's probably a couple of cases where that's because he's hired to update Mises, and Mises has some flaws. Okay, so anyway, it's a tremendous book, but Power Market, which is half the book, was not published at the same time. He had to split the book in half because the publishers in the 50s or 60s wouldn't publish it. It was too anarchistic. So he split it out, and then later it got published independently, and then it got put back together. So you can read this whole thing, right? So great, fundamental principles. But then you get people that have read, some lighter works, and they just, they fill in all the gaps themselves. They don't bother to read, thousands of pages of economics and work through each page one at a time to make sure they understand what these things mean. So there are some, time preference is, I would say, the second most fundamental principle axiom in economics. The first one is value is subjective. We don't know what's in people's heads. That was Carl Menger, and co-developed by somebody else. I should give him credit, but I never remember the name. So that founds what we call the Austrian school, because Menger was in Austria, and all the big wigs they were in Germany. he was provincial, so it was a derogatory term. It's Austrians, right? But value is subjective. That's his idea. And if you read Principles of Economics from Menger, that's the idea. He's beating it over your head over and over and over again. And it's the same stuff throughout the entire book because it's a new idea. After you know the idea, I read Rothbard first, right? You go back, you're like, man, you stop beating me up with this idea. I get it, right? But it drives home the point that value is subjective and that a trade between two people is they call it the nexus of trade, occurs because both people have something the other person wants and they value what the other person has over what they have to trade, right? And they also value it over all the other alternatives they have for it, right? So these people come together and they trade and now they're both wealthier. Economics is a positive sum game. Great idea, right? I mean, amazing, right? If you can trade, you're both wealthier. It's not zero sum. But the point is that my demand for what you have and your demand for what I have are relative to the things that we are trading for them, right? I demand what you have more than I have in my hand, and you demand what I have more than you have in your hand. That's the concept of supply and demand. Now, in that scenario I just gave you, who's the supplier? There is no supplier and demander. There's just two people doing the exact same thing on both sides of the trade. So this should be just make it fairly obvious that supply is something you do. It's not something you have, right? Supply and demand are two different words for the either side of a transaction. If I'm demanding something, he's my supplier. If he's demanding it, I'm his supplier. So this idea is inherent in all of Menger's writing, and he uses the term supply kind of loosely, like people use it. But if you actually understand what's being written, you realize, and this is clear if you post links to economic topics all the time. You can see this in people that really formally define these ideas in economics. But supply is not a quantity of something. It is the desire for somebody to have something else instead of it, right? My desire to trade it away. So products are something that people create. They don't exist in nature. What's sold is a product, right? Even if we call it a resource, it's a product that somebody produced and brought to market. That's supply. It's not the quantity of it that exists. There may or may not be relationships between these things, but keep in mind that economics is based on the most fundamental principle, which is value is subjective. So my desire to bring it to market is in my head. And your desire to get it from me at the market is in your head. These are both subjective. So Menger goes through, and Rothbard does, and Mises, they all do the same thing. They list these ladders, right, of preferences. I prefer this over this over this over this, and this person prefers this over this over this and this. And they're discrete. There's not continuous. You can't do math on them, right? And if mine aligns with yours, then there's a trade. That's it. They're perfectly symmetrical. So we get to this idea of supply and demand. And so those terms, the kind of concept and the graphing of supply and demand curves, that comes out later in Marshall's economics, who wrote the textbooks on economics that people still use today. And some Austrians were very critical of this because there's kind of separation of this idea of supply and demand as a subjective value and more of a tangible quantity thing. Formally, that's not what it is, but that's how people perceive it. So in other words, you start getting this metaphorical view instead of the literal view. Like literally what we mean by this is this, but we're going to kind of abstract that out and say, well, we talk about it more loosely. And then all of a sudden you're disconnected from reality. And so most people in Bitcoin, there are people that understand this. I get people, that's how economics works. But most people in Bitcoin are completely disconnected from reality. That is not the reality of Austrian economics. It's not how it works. So when you say Bitcoin is fixed supply, you are not referring to supply in the economic sense, which means the supply and demand ratio does not apply to your definition of supply, right? People don't want to hear that, but that's the truth. So then there are a lot of famous economists who don't get that right. And economics is one of the weakest disciplines in the world in terms of formality and rigor, right? It's all over the map. All kinds of people trying to do all kinds of stuff. But that's the reality of it. If you're gonna, if you call yourself an Austrian, a Mengerian, whatever, and you believe in the supply-demand relationship, supply and demand are just two people's desires meeting. So there's that, right? Those are the fundamentals. But then you've got this idea of time preference. What is time preference? Why is it important? Well, it's important because the previous, the kind of more fundamental principle is value is subjective. And if value is subjective, how can we know that somebody values, 1 Bitcoin today more than 2 Bitcoin tomorrow, right? Or vice versa. How do we know that time has any value to people? We can't know that time is valuable to people. Time with their goods is valuable to them because we said value is subjective. No, so it contradicts the value is subjective, right? So we have to come up with another assumption that says, even though value is subjective, in this case, we will assume that in our economic analysis, that any person values something now more than the same thing later. And if they're gonna trade for something now versus something later, they're gonna have to get more later. More of something, right? They're gonna have to be compensated for that time. You have to pay them for the time. Time has value, right? That's what time preference means. I prefer myself now more than I prefer it later. There's a number of ways you can phrase it, but that's the basic idea. It's an assumption we make. It's not a value judgment. Now is not better or worse than later. And it's not something we can derive from any kind of physical principles. It's something we assume because it contradicts subjective value. And why is it so important? Because without an idea of time preference, we would not be able to explain why people pay interest, right? Why does this happen? It happens because of time preference. Why does time preference happen? We assume it, right? So all of Austrian economics all of economics accepts these principles pretty much today, that time has value and we prefer now versus later. And if we're going to get later, we need to be paid more. That's called interest. It doesn't matter whether that's in a finance standpoint, capital gains or dividend income, or none of that matters. What matters is I put my money into something. I gave it over to this guy or gave it to my own factory. And because I'm going to have to wait to get it back, I need more. That's what time preference says. How much more? How much is it worth to you? So that's subjective, but we always assume it's more. If time preference was 0, then nobody would lend any money to anybody else to make something, and nothing would get made. So that's why we kind of feel safe assuming that people prefer now versus then, because if they didn't, nothing would get made and we'd all be dead. Okay, that's why markets, equity and credit markets, anything where there's people lending money to other people, they have positive yield over long periods of time, right? If they had no yield or negative yield net, then we'd all be dead. So that's why, that's called investment. When you lend your money to somebody and you get it back, and again, equity, whatever. Rothbard is also very clear on this. There's no economic distinction between debt and equity. It's a finance distinction. It's a law distinction, which is explicit about. But economically, money goes over here and I get some back later. It's got to be more, or I'm not going to do it anymore, right? If I didn't think I was going to get more, I wouldn't do it at all. And nothing would get produced because it takes time to produce stuff and it requires capital. Money has to be lent to the production. Okay, so we have this idea of production that's a consequence of time preference. It's the driver of all production. Okay, so if you understand that time preference exists to explain why people, have yield, have interest, you can probably understand that if I buy a chair from somebody, and I hold on to it for a while, I'm not getting yield from that chair or that couch or that car, that pile of rocks, or even that pile of gold. I'm not getting yield from that, and there's no interest coming to me because it's not producing anything and it's not selling it to anybody else. It can't be obtaining a profit, right? And the reason there's a profit is because people need stuff. And if the people making it didn't profit, they wouldn't make it. Okay, so to the extent that people can afford to buy what's being made, there's profit. There's not a lot of profit in trips to the moon today, but there might be in the future, right? It's too expensive. People don't want to pay for it. So things get made that people want, and that return a profit, and that's how people survive. And the reason the production happens is because of time preference and all that. Well, the important point of all this is that if it's not producing, if it's not yielding, it's not an investment. That's the distinction. It's a speculation. If I buy something expecting it to become worth more in the future, I'm just guessing a price will change. No reason to, know that one way or the other, but it's not yield. It's not an investment because it's not driven by time preference, right? So if somebody has something in their safe, say it's their gold for 10 years, whatever, it may or may not go up and down in price on the market. It can't store the value, right? Other people determine what it trades for in the future, but it's not producing anything, which means it doesn't have yield. It could go down, could go up, but generally what we expect to see is that those things, we call them commodities, just stay flat, right? They don't, they tend to be worth to other people as much as they were but not always. Sometimes they just don't get used anymore. And so you saved it, but now it's not worth anything, or they get used more. But there's no reason to think, unlike with markets, that they go up because they're not driven by time preference. I'm not lending it to somebody else to get it back later and therefore demanding more. I'm just holding on to it, right? I already have it. So time preference is what determines interest, and interest, the kind of competition for interest around the world is competition for capital. And that competition results in a free market, right? In the global free market, that competition for interest yields a single interest rate. Of course, there's different interest rates because it's not a pure, simple free market for interest around the world. But basically, you could say that rate it's around 10%, right? Take a total world index fund over the last 20 years, it's right around 10%. So stock, bond, equities and debt I'll put together. So let's just say, for example, the going rate for money around the world is 10%. So if you keep your money, say it's gold, right? It's not gonna be printed. Take your gold, put it in your safe, and it sits there for 10 years. You still have the gold, right? But if you earn 10% a year on that for say 7.5 years, you've doubled it. You've got twice as much gold because people paid you back in gold. So you earned yield on your gold. So time preference it's what determines the interest rate. Everybody's got a different preference for time, right? But they all compete, they're all competing to get as much as they can for their time. And people are competing to borrow their money, right? So they can produce and just pay as little for it as possible. So it's this, kind of same thing, supply and demand. But it's not based on the quantity of money. Again, supply is not a quantity. Supply is a demand. It's based on that desire, and that desire is time preference. So again, the units of money in existence are not supply, okay? Even in that sense. So we go back to time preference, and we're like, well, okay, let's you get this person talking about time preference, saying if you buy something and you hold on to it for a very long time, that means you have low time preference, right? High time preference means, so the high-low distinction has to be explained. In economics, high time preference means you need a lot of interest to let go of your money or your stuff, right? Like if I have a really high time preference, I might demand a 30-40% interest rate, or I'm not lending out my money. But if I have a really low time preference, I might demand a 5% interest rate, 2% even, right? And the market rate will be determined based on everybody competing for that, right? If I have a zero time preference, what does it mean? I have no time preference at all. I'll just lend out my money forever and never want it back. And if I have an infinite time preference, what does it mean? No amount of interest will make me let go of that money. I'm keeping it. Maybe I'm dying tomorrow. There's no way I'm lending out my stuff, right? Or the opposite. Maybe I'll give it all away because I'm dying tomorrow. Subjective, right? So this idea that you could take your money and hold on to it, hodl it for years, right, means you have low time preference is completely inverted. It's completely the opposite of the reality. Right? So when I started seeing this, I was just, I had just been refreshing my understanding of this stuff with man economy in the state. And I'm like looking at this going, what is this, right? So I think, to be fair, I think there's a reason, there's an understandable reason why you could get to that conclusion if you didn't really understand Bitcoin, or if you didn't really understand something about yield or investment, right? If you think that holding on to an asset appreciates in price is an investment that is returning you a yield, then you could fool yourself into thinking that holding on to that gold, for example, as an investment, right, that returns yield is low time preference, right? Because you're investing, but you're not investing because nobody's producing anything from it. You're not determining the interest rate, right? Because you're not lending anything. You're not competing in that market at all. You got something in a safe in the bottom of your basement and you're hoping it goes up in price. You have no say in the interest rate. Now, I've seen people argue like, well, by me not lending, it means I'm affecting the interest rate. Well, first of all, that's not what time preference means, right? But by you not lending, what does it mean? It means you're increasing the interest rate, if anything, right? But low time preference is the opposite. Low time preference means you're reducing the interest rate. You're lending freely at low rates. Low time, I have a very low preference for my time. High time preference means you're increasing the interest rate, which you'd be doing if you're holding onto your shit, right? So holding all your money is high time preference. There's no other way to interpret it. But the appearance of it being low time preference, because it appears like you're earning yield from the thing that you've stuck in your safe, is the reason for that error, I think. But after you've already written a book on it, and after you probably already sent it to the publishers, and then you send it to somebody like me, and I give you that critique, what are you going to do? You're going to double down, block me, and start selling your idea. And who's going to critique you? Nobody. So I just have fun with it because to me it's just kind of absurd. And does it matter? Yeah, it matters. People, if it's low time preference to hold your Bitcoin, that means you're investing. If you're investing, that means you're guaranteed a positive yield forever, right? That's on the average, investment has about a 10% annual yield. So that leads to the perception that number go up forever. That's kind of the lunar fallacy. Bitcoin go up forever. That has real consequences to the way people interact with Bitcoin. They treat it as a casino, not as a way for people to be able to move their money around when it's illegal. When they're in the jungles trying to 3D print their guns. So, okay, to me, there's real consequences to these errors. And the idea that number has been going up even recently, right? Tends to get people to double down on these errors, like, oh yeah, it's infinite moon money. The world's not going to perpetually pay people for doing nothing. That's not really reality. And we're doing something because we're holding. No, you're not. You're not doing anything. You're not producing. That's what economics means by doing something. So you're not producing, you're not trading, and the fact that you have it doesn't mean it's better than a bunch of other people having it, right? One person holding it is no different than somebody else holding. So, this argument that everybody holds and the price will go up, how does that make sense? Somebody always holds all money. If it's not in somebody's possession, it's not money anymore. All held by somebody all the time, no matter how much it's traded. So yeah, this is another narrative that just doesn't make any sense. Everybody hodls will make the number go up, and we'll never sell because there's no. And we're going to prove that by what? Burning our money. We're going to burn it to prove that we'll hodl forever. Okay, great. That's what I want to see Michael Saylor do. I want to see him burn all the money he spent because he's never going to sell. It's ridiculous, right? So these are I look at them as just kind of pump and dump schemes, right? If we can convince everybody else to value it more highly, then our number goes up. We're eventually going to sell because otherwise we get nothing out of it. We're going to trade it for something that we can use because money doesn't have use value. It's useless in and of itself. Okay, so that's my little rant on time preference and economics. But I'll maybe bring it back to your point. There's kind of two sectors of Bitcoin. There's the cypherpunk and there's the NGU, maxi price charting, rainbow chart crowd. And I don't have any problem with increasing demand, increasing price, people making some money on the monetization of a new money, right? But monetization doesn't go on forever. Fees increase. With Bitcoin has this inherent feature that no other money or thing in the world has, which is the more you use it around the world concurrently, the more it costs to use it, which is what makes it a stable money ultimately. That's a dynamic stability in an engineering sense. You have a negative feedback loop. So that's also true of things like gold or all other products. The more people demand them, the more it gets produced, which creates stability. All things have, products are essentially stable unless they're monopoly controlled, like the dollar. The production is controlled by a monopoly. You can't make your own, so it's not stable. So with Bitcoin, you have stability that's produced by changing demand. Fees increase, reduces demand. If in everything else, you have stability is produced by increasing supply. Demand increases, more gets made. But if you think back to what I said about supply and demand, those aren't really different things, right? They're both demand. So this perception that people have, at least from a rational economic standpoint, and with an understanding of how Bitcoin works, doesn't hold up. And the idea that despite increasing demand, increasing fees, therefore suppressing demand, we want to have everything, all piled into this one chain, because if we do that, our number will just keep going up despite fees, right? No matter, I mean, the transaction value had to get, higher and higher and higher for you to be willing to pay higher and higher and higher fees, which means all the lower value transactions don't exist on Bitcoin anymore, right? We used to have free transactions. I sent Bitcoin. I don't even want to look up how much, but I sent Bitcoin to Satoshi when I was doing test cases early on. I just, 0.01 or something. I don't know. I would just send them to Satoshi addresses, and then I would be able to just go up, just have the block explorer or whatever refresh and go, okay, there it is. Okay, it all worked good. And, it wasn't worth that much. Transactions were free, fees were free. You could send small amounts. But that's gone now. Those small transactions, don't happen on Bitcoin anymore. Okay, so we can keep raising this up, and side chain, and call that scaling. But what people, especially maxi crowd, refuse to kind of want to acknowledge is that there's competition, right? It may be all shitcoins right now, but there's nothing preventing another Bitcoin chain from erupting and doing these, change a few bits here and there, and boom. And that's a substitute. And it can be a very effective substitute, a lower security level, handle smaller transactions. This is kind of what Litecoin does, right? It's faster, smaller transactions, lower security, but pretty much the same implementation. And change the mining algorithm, the hashing algorithm. So that's competition. If none of that competition exists, presumably there'd be higher demand on the Bitcoin chain. But maybe that all that demand would flow to dollars and whatever. It's just an inherent economic reality. People can try to deny it, but the fact is it exists, and it will remain. That there will be competition, and it's not going to always be scams, even if it always is now. When the demand is high enough, that will happen. And if the demand is high enough, and that could happen once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, whatever, will just keep happening. So while people are continuing to focus on reducing security in other ways, that keeps the primary transactions on the chain. I'm talking about side chains, Lightning Network, et cetera, right? Those are security reductions. They can't be stronger than the primary chain. Plus, they add more and more assumptions. Like, for example, Lightning, you have to monitor your transactions. You can get robbed. So you can not be able to settle in time, right? So these things were known from the beginning. When Lightning was first presented, I think in Hong Kong scaling, these were debated in the room. I remember Zuko was there, a bunch of other people were there, like, people that knew what they were kind of talking about, I think were, I was fairly new at the time, but there was real critique. Those critiques, they were acknowledged, but we got pretty far down the road, and we realized that. So people used to ask me, what's going to happen? I said, well, I don't work on Lightning. First of all, I'm not an expert in it, in the implementation details, But the basic principle is that, you have to be able to settle on chain in a certain amount of time for you to be able to be secure. And the argument that that can get too expensive or not timely was kind of ignored, right? And it was known from the very beginning. I was just repeating the arguments that people had made from the beginning. And since fees were low, it kind of worked. And then all of a sudden, I mean, it still works. I'm not, dashing lightning or anything, but the point is that people willfully ignored these things. And then all of a sudden things started to change. That's happened more recently. And people are starting to recognize that that's a limitation. Like, well, of course it's a limitation. But when I pointed out this limitation and these kind of limitations, it's just an example, kind of sidechain like thing. The answer was, the narrative was that we will just keep all of our money in Lightning channels. So we will never settle. Right. So now you've just disconnected. It's like, you had gold and dollars. They were connected and now they're disconnected. Right. You completely lost your security model if you can't settle. You can just get robbed. Right. Who does anything about it? Again, not a Lightning expert, but I think that people have started to realize that that's actually not reasonable. Right. Keeping everything forever in Lightning isn't really reasonable. And you got heavy centralization required in order to kind of make it efficient. There's real issues, right? So the only point I'm trying to make is there are trade-offs. This is not a straight up security one-to-one with level layer one, which is kind of how it's been promoted. There will always be trade-offs when you establish a credit for money system, even if it's one-to-one, like a money certificate, like Lightning. And so when I said to your questions earlier that these things that we're talking about, those aren't Bitcoin, right? Those are credit for Bitcoin, no matter how you slice it. If they're established by leaving the chain and they're settled by returning to the chain, that's how you settle the credit. It's credit from an economic standpoint. Doesn't make it bad, right? And it doesn't make it insecure. It just means there's a cost associated with it, and it's not the same thing. And credit will always exist alongside money and always has. They're a duality, credit and money, and they're connected by time preference, right? Which determines the interest rate. So, and without it, there's no production. So people that don't want, lending, which is always fractional reserve, don't seem to understand, the basic economic principles. That production is required for survival, and production requires yield, and yield requires lending. And lending can be equity or debt. It doesn't really make any difference. It's the same thing. So credit systems scale money in a way, right? They're not real money. Bank money is not money. It's a money substitute, and it causes the expansion of credit on money or a credit on assets, right, is a function strictly of time preference. It's not like it's ongoing, right? Whatever the time preference is today is what the credit is established today. Time preference changes, the amount of credit will change. If the amount of money changes or the amount of assets change, the amount of credit as a proportion of that, may change. But it's not like it's just kind of perpetually spinning out of control. There's a certain level of credit established against any money, and that is going to, does apply to Bitcoin. It's never going to change. So it's credit scales money to a limit, which is kind of the limit of a time limit established by time preference. But that's not enough, maybe, right? You might need to scale the money more because of fees. And I've been told by some prominent maximalists that the reason this goes way back, is before it became such a big thing. The reason they like this idea is because if we keep everything on the chain, it drives the number up, and that they've got Bitcoin, it makes them wealthier. They were, very open about it. Deny it now, or don't respond to it now if I mention it, but I've been around long enough to have heard those things turn into big narratives, and turn into, oh, we're really saving the world from all these scams. Yeah, there's some value in pointing out things are scams. People aren't that stupid. Some people are going to get taken into them, but most people, just give them a little information and they're great. But not everything is a scam, right? Then this is, I've been just saying those words makes me a heretic and a shitcoiner, even though I spent 10 years working on nothing at all except Bitcoin, not even the side chains, right? Just Bitcoin. but just pointing out the fact that other instances of the Bitcoin code can produce another chain with very little modification, and certainly no modification to the concepts in Satoshi's white paper. They don't want to hear that, right? And I don't promote it. I just point out that it's an economic force, and it already exists, and it's scaling. Right? It takes demand away from like, for example, LTC. Litecoin takes demand away from Bitcoin in some way. If you toss Litecoin, there'd probably be some more demand on Bitcoin. Maybe not, but like, take away all the other coins and imagine no impact on Bitcoin whatsoever. That's a little bit hard to imagine, right? There is an effect, and that effect is substitution. And if Bitcoin can't handle certain transactions and there's no other shit coins to handle them, where is it going to go? It's going to go to it's going to go to state shit coins. It's going to go to dollars. It's going to go to euros. It has to. So other coins do and will substitute for Bitcoin. That is already the case. And pretending that is not the case is not rational. Trying to force an irrational kind of, or force a non-economic solution onto people because you want to make your number go up also isn't rational. To me, I don't care about it. I want something that works, and that will be that can continue to work. And so, number being high enough to provide security for the chain, great. That's great. Bitcoin being private enough so that people can transact without, just getting KYC'd and arrested, or, getting their minds co-opted or shut down. That's important. And some people will argue that, ETFs, right, bring so much money to Bitcoin, it'll, make it so much more valuable. It'll be so popular and they can't do anything about it, which is still my current argument. We'll make it so popular they won't be able to shut it down, even though they shut down gold, right? It's ridiculous. Of course, they can pass a law if they want to. And now, years after I started saying these things, now it's all become quite evident the path that states are going to take, and have been slowly just chipping away as they become more interested. So you get all the old arguments about jurisdictional arbitrage, we'll just move over here, move over there, but, they can't 51% attack because they couldn't possibly, grab a few, mining rigs and start mining. Don't have nearly enough capital, which is ridiculous. So I'm interested in solutions that actually help Bitcoin survive, to the point where people can continue to use it, not so they can pretend it's an investment. Right? Hold their value. Yeah, well, it doesn't store value, but if people continue to value it, then it'll be worth something, after you save it for a while. Can you prove that? No, it's subjective. But we would like to produce a money that, people value and can use privately without permission from the state. Because when you need permission, then you're back to it's the dollar. And it's subject to not just the dollar, but it's every current, it's every shit paper currency around the world. So I don't want to, that's what happened with PayPal when it started as Confinity. That's what they were trying to do. They were trying to help people avoid currency controls in corners of the world by using mobile payments. They couldn't solve that problem because they weren't Satoshi. So they started, doing payments on eBay. But, I don't want to see Bitcoin just be used as PayPal, which is, to me, that's the sailor vision, right? I'm just not interested. Digital energy.
No, I don't think that's a sailor version. The sailor version is that of digital gold, which, according to his thesis, is basically institutions holding large amounts of Bitcoin and everyone transacting on their balance sheet. And it's perverse, but this is a scaling layer for Bitcoin.
That's a Bitcoin standard.
On
right? Everybody has the the big companies, so the Federal Reserve, right, holds all the Bitcoin, and we just transact on some kind of paper ledger, centralized ledger.
and people say this is bullish. They say, oh, it's exactly what Bitcoin should be, and ask them how. They say because it ends central banking. It stops fiat money printing. And I'm like, how?
Yeah, it doesn't.
Even
And
so,
when I say people,
hypothetically
though,
thinking,
sorry, go ahead.
hypothetically saying, let's assume that fiat money is going to go away and we're going to go to some Bitcoin standard where the national currency of every nation state in this world is going to be Bitcoin. And this is going to make wars more difficult to finance and stuff like that. What prevents a government from issuing a token on Bitcoin saying, you give me one Bitcoin, I give you 10 of these tokens, with the promise that in 2 years after we end this war and we win the war and we take the resources of the other nation, you're going to get 2 Bitcoins back. There's nothing stopping them from doing that. That's how it's always been.
Well, I mean, let me give you a little, maybe more straightforward, a simpler example of just, okay, so let's say that Bitcoin is very successful, and ultimately the value people get out of the value proposition of Bitcoin is that they have more money, right? They get to keep more of their own money. They get to move it around with less tax. They don't go to jail for doing things with it that they want to. It's worth more to them. They have more money. But and inflation, right, is one way you take some money away from them. It's not because of the quantities of dollars printed, it's because of the cost of printing them is below market price. So monopoly protection. And so we have this idea that Bitcoin will be so successful that people won't use dollars, euros, state money anymore. They use Bitcoin and they'll have to build on top of this system. And so it'll be hard money underneath. And since it can't be counterfeited, right? There's nothing they can do. But say you're white market, you're Apple or you're Google, Microsoft, whatever, and you're using your Bitcoin, and the state steps in and says, oh, you're making a transaction. Well, we need to KYC everything, and we need to take a 10% cut on your Bitcoin. A transaction tax, okay, but more to the point, more closer to the that's kind of effectively inflation. You're losing value from your money, right? Every time you use it. Well, you can say, well, we can do it in the black market. I'm like, well, that's kind of my point. In order to have security, you have to be in the black market because they just passed a tax law, right? But certain parts of the world, like including say Austria during World War II, have experimented with demurrage currency. Demurrage money, so it's fairly well understood. It's another way to do inflation. It's just more complicated and more visible. But demurrage money is where a certain unit of a certain bill, for example, has a tax on it, and if you don't pay the tax, say every year, go down to the bank and pay your tax on your $100 bill, then it's no longer valid. So in other words, when somebody goes to spend it, you can trade it around, but whoever the last guy holding it is, who hasn't paid the tax, is eventually going to get, try to put it in the bank, pay his taxes, but there's something to be worth nothing. So it's basically counterfeit if you haven't paid your tax on it. That's demurrage. And the effect of demurrage is the money, if you have to pay a 10% tax on it every year, after how many years is it worth? Basically nothing, not too long, right? So nobody wants to hold on to it. People get rid of it as fast as they can. Well, it sounds an awful lot like, the Venezuelan bolivar, right? I've got this. It's going to nothing quick. I get rid of it. It's inflationary. Demurrage money is inflationary money without printing anymore. You're just charging a tax on it. So if you're operating in the white market and you've got Bitcoin underlying your whole system, why not just implement demurrage on the Bitcoin? You're controlling all the transactions, right? You're allowing people to transact or not transact. They're in the white market. With a 51% attack, you can enforce that, right? So state imposes, people are not paying their taxes, so they just impose a 51% attack, right? Now you can't get a transaction through unless you've paid your demurrage on the money. That's inflation. Does it fucking matter that it's 21 million Bitcoins? No. This is what, this whole fascination with the idea that the technology is what secures your value, your money, right, is so deeply flawed. The technology gives you the opportunity to do it, but only people can do it. And with sufficient control, the entire system, right, with 51% hash power, the entire system can be brought under state control, turned into a demurrage money without hard forking anything, and people basically have their inflationary money back. You could save it for 100 years, hodl it forever, come back, and now you owe 99.9% of it in tax in order to transact it. Great. what did that achieve, right? So if the system doesn't have the ability to withstand those types of attacks, it's not useful. And building up more and more white market presence in Bitcoin doesn't contribute to that security. Because you don't even have to 51% attack, Apple, right? You just tell them, present them with their transaction, with their bill, right, for using their money. And so the white market has no security against those things. It's the black market that would be defending itself from a 51% attack. The white market pays all their taxes. That's what makes them white market. They're not breaking the law. So they pay all their taxes, but then there's this growing black market that continues to use Bitcoin and not pay their tax on it. So state now has a real incentive to implement a 51% attack, which people, since the time of Andreas have said it's not possible, which is really nonsense. Of course they can do it. Right now there's 2 companies that have more than half the hash rate. Denial is not a security model. There's reasons to, there are many people that understand this and are working towards real solutions to allow people to do things like mine at low volume. Say Steve Barber's, upstream data, making, containers that mine on flare gas anywhere. He grew that from nothing since I've known him to real business. And I like that, right? That's great. Setting up a massive data center somewhere in the States, or what is that? What is that doing? Just walk in there and take all the rigs, right? You're not compliant, bye. Or if you are compliant, doesn't matter. You're doing what we want. It's great. So I poke. And I'm not on a crusade. I kind of poke fun at things like this hype around it's digital energy, let's go white market, and this is necessary. It's all counterproductive, although there's no stopping it, right? It's not like me saying something is going to change the pump and dump or the NGU narrative. People are going to flock to Bitcoin because the numbers going great, but somebody has to keep working on the securing of Bitcoin. It means, I'm not talking about the technology, right? Somebody has to keep working on how we're gonna transact it privately, how we're gonna mine it privately in sufficient capacity to overcome state-sponsored 51% attacks. And that's not, the arguments used to be, well, hard fork. I don't know, 8-9 years ago, I was arguing that was dumb. Create a new coin because they 51% attacked our coin means that we're now smaller and weaker, and all the miners that were on the right side are now out of business, and you just keep doing it over and over again until you're zero. And that's happened in altcoins. So people don't make that argument anymore. So what is the argument? Right? What keeps the 51% attack from wiping out the black market in Bitcoin? It's fees. Miners that take transactions that are not allowed have the possibility of making higher fees. And so why do people pay high fees to get their transactions mined? Because they're not getting confirmed. It already happens. It's unnatural. But it has to be worth it to them, or they won't do it. So that's not a big differential, right? It's not necessarily big, the difference between the market rate of fees and what people are willing to get their unauthorized transactions mined. That's what secures Bitcoin against a 51% attack. It's what makes it permissionless, that willingness of people to pay for the permissionlessness. So anyway, in order for people to do that, you have to be able to operate secretly at small scale with reliable equipment, hardware, whatever, software. And so, my part is to kind of help people see that security model, and also to implement code that can support those types of scenarios easily. So everybody has to have a node to do anything with Bitcoin. It's like a router. You can't outsource your router. So everybody having a node. It's something that I think that people have been around for a while understand. You can't be involved with Bitcoin and not have a node. You can't transact it and you can't mine it. Right? You can hodl it, but you're not involved. You're not doing anything. You might as well burn your coin if you hodl forever. So you don't have any say in security. You know, when you finally transact, you still don't have a say because you're selling. But when you buy, when somebody gives you Bitcoin for something, you now can validate what they've given you and say, no, that's not real money. Now you matter to the security model. Another thing people don't seem to understand, their hodling is not securing Bitcoin. So, they'll argue, well, if there's a fork, we can sell one side. I'm like, great, but what if there's not a fork? You're not doing anything. And if there is a fork, you just move the coin from one person to another. Who cares? So, yeah, I'm rambling.
Yeah, I think the idea of having you debating Michael Saylor could be a lot of fun. And I don't think he would accept this. Maybe we can try this on Twitter, just tag him and say, hey, we have this guy. He has been researching economics and has a different idea about whatever you want to contest. But anyway, I gotta present a couple more ads at this point before
Yeah, go ahead.
I see that people
I'm eating my bagel.
start dropping. Yeah, take a short break. So I'm gonna present a scaling solution for Bitcoin, which is peer-to-peer and is human-to-human. It's called Sado Dime. It's like the open source version of the Open Dime. It's based on a smart card. You load it with your Bitcoin and you give it to someone as a gift. You give it to someone who is your peer, is your friend, is someone you're gonna meet in meet space. It's about 20 euro. You can use promo code BTCTKVR to get a discount on your purchase. It's a pretty cool wallet, and they also have the Seed Keeper. They also have the Sado chip, which is supposed to be a hardware wallet that's based on a smart card. You can find the source code on the Sado Dime and Sado chip repositories on GitHub. And what else should I say about it? Yeah, you can listen to an interview with them in this season of the Bitcoin Takeover podcast. I think it's episode 20. They explain all about this product and how it works. And if you want to make an opinion before purchasing anything, feel free to do that. And also, I have to present an ad for IVPN. If you want to have privacy on the internet, then it's probably a good idea to use a VPN, even though you're not going to get privacy against your ISP who's going to know that you're using a VPN. But in conjunction with Tor and other tools, it can be super private. And what's special about IVPN is that it generates codes for accounts. So you don't have to sign up with your email. You don't have to sign up with your credit card or whatever. You just open the Tor browser, you go to ivpn.net, you generate a new code, you pay with your Bitcoin, and you can also pay with Lightning if you want. And then you're going to top up your account for a month. If you don't want to spend money on it yet and you want to try the product first, you can send an email to trial@ivpn.net and you're going to receive a code for a 30-day trial. Just make sure you don't use an email with your real name on it. Just use the one that you're using probably for trolling me on Twitter. Use that one and it will be fine for your privacy. You can mention that you got the idea of asking for the review code from Bitcoin Takeover podcast. I think that helps, but I'm not sure if it helps you too much because you're narrowing down your anonymity set. But still, it's pretty cool. Give it a try. And also, if you want to help me buy a Supra, I set this goal that I need to sell 10,000 crypto steel metal plates. I think I sold like 4 this week, so I'm down to 9,996. So go to cryptosteel.com, see if you can find any of these metal plates that you like. You can store your Nostr private key, you can store your BIP39 seed phrase, you can store your passphrase, you can store any password that is significant to you and you don't want to get destroyed in the event of a fire or a flood or whatever. CryptoSteel is the OG company that has been building these devices since 2013, and they are true Bitcoiners. They stuck to their business model. They have open sourced the design of their first product, and now it's being copied dozens of times. I also have a video in which I compare the CryptoSteel cassette with the Billfuddle, if you want to make your own opinion on which product is better. And get that one, use promo code BTCTKVR, you get 10% off, and I also get like $6, which isn't much, but if it adds up, I can buy a Supra and I can enjoy the Supra cycle. So yeah, do that. And thank you, Eric, for sitting through all of this commercial break.
I don't know. I'm rooting for you with the super cycle there.
Yeah, what's your take on the Supra cycle?
I don't
And
know
for
anything
this, I
about it
gotta show you.
except the little pictures and the tweets I see coming out for years on the super cycle. I think it's yeah, that's familiar. Yeah.
Basically, I drew a line, right?
I especially like the one where the tweet where you compared it to somebody's, NGU chart. Um, you were like, I came to the same conclusion, but I put a lot less effort into it.
That
That
was
was
actually fun because someone came up with a coefficient of 0.8 and said that there's gonna be every cycle, there's gonna be this increase in price, and made the prediction for like 30 years where Bitcoin is going to be, and said, yeah, it's gonna be at 1 million per coin at this point in time. And I was like, I got to the same 100K prediction just by drawing a line on this chart with the super cycle. It's hilarious.
Yeah, well, those charts all look the same to me, whether they're right side up or upside down.
Yeah, but my point is that there are so many prediction models there, and people try to say, oh, Bitcoin is going to do this and that. At least mine is inspirational in the sense that it tells you to do something with your life. Get a
Yeah.
nice sports car, get a girlfriend, take it from there. Don't wait forever until the number goes up. I don't think you're going to regret owning a nice car and having a girlfriend. Those are not, I mean, unless the girlfriend is crazy or something, but or you drive into a tree, but these are different problems. But basically, I think it's nicer than waiting for the number to go up forever and having no goals in your life. Just take it from here. Get a Supra. I hope Toyota pays me for this. I hope they hear this.
No
Because
shit.
right now you can buy a Supra with a Bitcoin. You can buy more than a Supra. I guess you can get a very fancy one with lots of options.
For sales have been going up around the world because of your free promo. They should be paying you.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of OGs messaged me and said, Vlad, what's wrong with the Supra? Or why do you promote this Supra? What's so special about it? And I told them, it's the plebs Lambo. It's about 90% of the Lambo experience at 10% of the Lambo price. What's not to like about it? And it's more reliable than Lambo. So,
Yeah.
yeah, most of us will never get Lambos. Or if we can afford Lambos, what's the point?
Yeah,
Why are
that
you
was
going
what I
to
was going
buy
to say.
that?
Once you get to the point where you can afford it, you don't want it anymore. And the guys that actually do get them, yeah, good on them. But
Yeah, there's Parviz Malakuti in the chat who says that he's listening to Man, Economy, and the State on Audible, and he has 57 hours left.
and that's I needed to be staring at pages for hours at a time. Slow going. If I just heard it going by like that, I don't think I would get it. But and there's some pictures there too. You got to see. Audible is
I don't know how it can be an audio book, granted that there are some pictures in the original. Maybe there's a very vivid description made by the narrator. I don't know.
it'd be tough. I mean, I mean, it's good. Probably get 80% of it or so. But there's thing about economics is it's just not intuitive. It's counterintuitive, and that's why you end up with communism and mass murder because people people just their day-to-day experience and the way they talk about things, the words they use are just drive them into a different way of thinking of things, and that's it took centuries, millennia before people really started to understand the way these the kind of principles worked. And it wasn't even, I don't know, was it the 1800s, Menger, where we got kind of got to this point where we realized that the value of things is not in the things. That was a really fundamental change to the way people saw how things worked. Except for Karl Marx, who saw the value of things was put in them by labor, right? The labor theory of value. And by the way, I've used that to describe this kind of energy in Bitcoin fallacy, right? Like the value of the Bitcoin is the labor that went into it. You know, if you think of labor as a metaphor for energy or as an equivalent for energy, the energy that went into it is its value. Even if you're just taking the metaphorical view, not the literal view,
Wait,
right?
wait, wait. So are you telling me that people who pose as Austrian economists are using Marx's
Yeah, there's the
theory?
irony, right? You got it. Right. There's the irony. Right. I'm here posing as an Austrian economist telling you the labor theory of value is what gives Bitcoin its uniqueness, right? It's absolutely ridiculous. And they don't even see it, right? Like, no, the work that went into the money is not what gives the money its value. Right? It's counterintuitive, right? It makes sense to people who haven't really given it that much thought. But what really focused that question, you know, a long time ago was the diamond water paradox, which if you look up in Wikipedia subjective value, you'll find the article on economic subjective value. And there's this section on the diamond water paradox. And the diamond water paradox, for your listeners who may not know, is the fact, is the observation. It's a theoretical that in some cases, so that it's based on the idea that the whatever determines value is in the thing, right? So in some cases, you would think maybe diamonds are worth more than water. How much? But who knows, right? But you might go to one place where there's a certain amount of water that's equal to some smaller amount of diamond, and that's the measure, right? These are equal to each other because this is what they're trading at. But then you go somewhere else, say a desert island, where diamonds aren't worth squat, and you need water, right? Water's worth more. Or you go to some place where there's a giant lake, right? Fresh water's abundant, diamonds are worth more. Why is that? If the value is objectively in the thing, and it was put there. Now, Marx said it was put there because of labor, and he wasn't the first. I think Adam Smith was essentially a labor, theory of value guy as well. But in Marx's time, this had been discredited, and he was discredited by his peers immediately. He was a failed economist by any measure, by his own measure, right? It was only these communist hacks that kind of brought him forth as some great visionary, so they could have some god to pray to, right? But he was a failed economist. His ideas didn't make sense, and now you get Carl Menger and what they call the marginalist revolution, right? Which was this sea change in economic theory and all of it, which I think was fairly contemporary. I don't know what the time. I'm not a historian. What the difference was between Marx and Menger in time, but this idea that the value is not in the thing, and it can't therefore be put in the thing by the production cost, is an important discovery. That's the most fundamental aspect of Austrian economics. And when you have somebody saying, it's the energy, it's in there, and it can't get out unless it just moves around. It's in there. It's what determines the value. It's the labor theory of value. It's ludicrous, and it rejects the most fundamental idea of Austrian economics. And so when I go out there and I poke fun at it, and people say, no, it's just a metaphor. I'm like, well, yeah, but it's a stupid metaphor, especially for somebody who claims to be Austrian. I don't know, am I missing something?
No, I think we have to appeal to another meme from the Bitcoin community, which says that this time it's different, So everything you previously knew or learned, you have to throw that all away and embrace this ideology which flip-flops between arguments and just picks the one that's most convenient for the situation and
Pick
tells
the
you
one
to
that
forget.
supports what you want to see happen.
I mean,
Right?
they endorsed stock to flow with a straight face, and they said, yeah, this makes sense.
Wasn't
The last time we recorded an interview, it was back in 2020, so 4 years ago. And you took your time to explain why stock to flow is wrong and it's not Austrian, and why first of all, it makes predictions, which is praxeologically wrong. And secondly, it assumes that demand is going to remain constant or increase over time, which once again is super wrong.
But also the most simple way to look at it is what I explained to you about what supply means, right? Supply in Bitcoin is the demand for Bitcoin. It's the demand and the anti-demand. It's not how many there are. So by saying that supply is fixed and demand is constant, you've made two significant errors, right? And value being subjective, you can't predict these demands. The future is unpredictable. And there you have Austrian economics in a nutshell being turned upside down by the rainbow guy. And I don't think he came up with the idea, though. He just came up with the charts. Wasn't it Seyfedin who published, kind of promoted the whole stock to flow idea in his book? I don't remember. I think that was where I think some people even speculated that he was the guy underneath the hat, but I don't know. I actually
No,
don't know.
it's some guy who's a banker from the Netherlands. He's much younger than he presents himself as. He was doxxed by Corey Clipston, or whatever his name is, the CEO of Swan.
Yeah.
So the guy came up with this, and he ran a cult, and he created this model which he adjusted like 2 or 3 times according to market action to say, oh no,
Climate
I
model.
miscalculated, This is the new
Yeah.
one. This is the one that's correct.
Well, that was inevitable. Yeah, it's a climate model. Yeah. Models are great at predicting the past. But as Yogi Berra once said, prediction is hard, especially about the future.
Was that Yogi Bear?
Yogi Berra.
Okay.
So I
Sorry.
don't know if this is some American culture that, I can sprinkle on you. You probably don't know who he is, right? Yogi Berra, I think he's still alive. He played for years for the Yankees. I think he's still a coach of the Yankees. He was famous for making deeply philosophical sounding quotes as just a regular guy baseball player. And he's such a character that they actually made the cartoon Yogi Bear after him. And that's been around a long time, right? Yogi Bear card. I was a kid when I watched Yogi Bear. He's still alive, so I'm pretty sure I have that right. And Yogi Berra he's probably credited with more great quips than he actually made, but there are some, many that have been. I've got a book on Yogi Berra quotes, and prediction is hard, especially about the future. Is one of my favorites. To baseball, and in baseball they would say the game, the game ain't over till the fat lady sings. They get out the microphone and sing the national anthem in the beginning. I don't know. I guess they used to sing something at the end. The game ain't over till the fat lady sings. And Yogi say the game ain't over till it's over.
Nice.
So something like 50% of baseball is 90% mental, or vice versa. I can't remember. So yeah, that's Yogi Berra.
I have a couple of other questions from people on Twitter that I really want to ask you because I think they're fun. There's Alex Berg who says, can you ask him about dumb narratives like scaling via shitcoins? And there's a tweet by Giacomo Zucco that I can't open because Giacomo blocked me.
Yeah, he blocked me last year. Yep. And it was because he started going on. I made a comment about how when fees started to shoot up last year, I made a comment about how it shouldn't surprise anybody, right? That this is happening, and transaction demand appeared to be flowing to altcoins, including Litecoin, because their transaction volume was apparently going up. So I made a comment about that because it relates to my observation that substitutes do exist for Bitcoin. And this is what you would expect to happen if you were following somebody for economic truth versus, dietary advice. So he got in a little spat. Now, Giacomo, I always considered us friends. We've known him for a long time, but he blocked me because, the only reason to block somebody is because you don't want your followers seeing what they say, I guess. I mean, or you don't want to be critiqued. I've never blocked anybody. I've got trolls that fucking follow me and I don't block them. I mute them. I mute people that take too much time, but so anyway, John, I don't know what he's saying either because he got me blocked, but I get the gist of it because it's the same thing over and over again, right? And I don't think he really truly believes I'm a shitcoiner because he knows I've been working in Bitcoin probably as long as he has, and I've never worked on anything but Bitcoin, and I've never promoted any coin ever, right? Or anything else, and I never made a nickel for working on anything related to Bitcoin. So, but the Maxi Lord does not want to hear the narrative questioned. And that's kind of what it comes down to. So I don't know. What was the question that was asked? Scaling through shitcoins?
Yeah.
I think we already discussed it. I don't think there's any. It was a great lengthy discussion about it. Just scroll back.
I just wanted to specifically name call him, so maybe if he searches for the transcript of this, he's gonna find an answer. Zagoras, you asked me if he is some sort of sock puppet, but he's not. I've met him in person. He's a real person, even if he's a furry. But he wants me to ask you about your response about you losing to Saifedean in the economic study race, whatever that means.
I don't know what it means, so I'm not in any race. I don't know what I could be losing. And that's, I asked him, what's this race you're talking about? And he didn't respond. So I don't know. I mean, sounds like he's being, he's like, well, he sells more books than me. And, obviously, therefore he's right or something. I don't know. That's the answer to that. It's a simple logical fallacy. Popularity is not, it's not a reasoned argument. Um, you know, um, Communism's pretty popular. Is it based on flawed economic theory? That was a large part of the world that was under it for a long time. So yeah, we can talk about how I talked at length about the inversion of time preference. Okay, am I wrong because a lot of people don't understand it? No, I don't think so. If somebody has a reasoned argument, I'll listen to it, and I always do. But these things are not hard to discern from lots that it's been written about them over the years by the people who created the concepts. And so the race, I don't know. I mean, I had a, this is about life. I got a computer science degree. I like coding. I did 10 years in the Navy. I was a fighter pilot, did 2 tours in the war in Bosnia. I came out of that, started a software company, sold it to Microsoft, started another one. It's still out there, Beyond Trust. It's gotten pretty big. I started working on Bitcoin as kind of a retirement project. I was gonna make a hardware wallet at some point, and I decided not to, and that was before Trezor came out. So I tell people, I mentioned today that I retired before Satoshi. I mean, so what's this race we're in? I mean, Saifedean showed up in 2017. He started writing some nonsense economics, and people lapped it up, right? Well, the sailor's doing it now. It's a common theme, and people will say to me, well, it's great because it brings people in, and it doesn't have to be right. It's just about I'm fine. Yeah, great. It's but don't tell me my theory's wrong, right? No, it's not. And I gave away my book, my PDF of the full thing, absolutely free. You go print it out if you want, or you can get the ebook or the whatever. But people have translated my book because they wanted to. I give them royalties and whatever. But I've never ever, I don't think I've ever promoted it. I'm not promoting it now. You promoted it, right? I don't sit here with a bookshelf behind me with all my books stacked up trying to sell them when I'm doing a podcast. I've seen that one. I didn't even, I think I went to Bitcoin Miami a couple of years ago, and they wanted me to, because I was speaking, they wanted me to have my book there. So I sent them like 500 copies of the book, or a couple, I don't remember how it was. I never got paid. I didn't even go over to the book area. I don't even know how many I know they were selling them because I saw people walking around with them, but I never got paid. I didn't care. I'm like, I could keep them. I'm not in this to make money on Bitcoin. And, I don't make money on my book. I don't care. It's not a race. I held the conference during the COVID, and I was lucky to break even. That was great. The money that would have come out of the conference, it would have gone straight into open source development for Libbitcoin developers. I've probably spent $500,000 of my own money out of my pocket to fund Libbitcoin developers. Never taken any money, even donations, for myself. So I'm paying to build what we need in this community. I'm not in a race to make money on it or to, to be the most popular. I've spoken at every conference that I found relevant all over the world. I don't, I don't have anything to prove to anybody. But, some people, that's their business. They make money on this stuff, and they got to create controversy, and they can't admit wrong because they're financially locked into their points of view, right? I mean, Giacomo's locked into maximalism. If you rejected that, so there's no way he's ever going to say anything about it. And I don't know. Who can argue with that? I understand it. And Saifedean's locked into that book that he had probably sent to the printer before he sent me the copy to review. So yeah, I understand it. And there's mistakes in my book, right? I wrote things, I look back and I'm like, oh yeah, it's not quite right. I should need to edit that, but I'm too lazy. So, I've had discussions with people that have led me to fix things, and I fix them on so the entire history of every change that ever occurred to the chapters of my book is on the GitHub repo. It's in the Libbitcoin system GitHub repo where the wiki is. Every single word that's ever changed in that history since I first put them down is on the repo, and that's always been available for free. It's the entire, and somebody, friend of mine, Italian guy, he went and updated the entire wiki to match the content of the book because there've been a bunch of edits in the book. So even those changes are in the wiki. So you have an entire history of every change I've ever made. So you can see how even my thinking, in my book has evolved over time. I talk to people, I debate, I discuss, I learn things, or give you an example, James Chang, who did the illustrations for the book, he was also editing and tried to produce the first book before I did. And he had a question about one chapter. And I remember thinking, his questions, he's a smart guy, and he worked on Libbitcoin doing documentation for a while as well. And I'm like, you're right. That's not there's a logical error there. I made a leap that I can't make, and I got to fix it. It led to a much better explanation and theory that was provable as a consequence of fixing that error. But if anybody doubts, that I'm like, if anybody thinks I get this all the time. You're rigid. You don't listen to people. I'm like, you can see the entire history of my changes on the wiki, right? So bullshit. No. And you won't find a free copy with all the change history that ever occurred before production. You won't find the old tweets. You won't find all that stuff inside. But he's just selling whatever the latest. Now he's getting, he kicked out whatever his name is. The guy that did the intro.
Yeah, Taleb. But that was sort of his mentor because both are from Lebanon.
His mentor, who turned out to be like a flaming lunatic, and so he takes him out and puts Sailor in. Right? I think I just saw that. There was like I saw the intro, the cover on some picture that went by on Twitter and said Sailor. I'm like, oh, he kicked him out and put Sailor in. That's great.
What's even more fascinating about that story is that at that point, Sailor had been in Bitcoin for less than 1 year, and he was already invited to write the foreword for the best-selling book in the space.
Right. And you know who wrote the foreword for my best-selling book?
I can tell who. Yeah, look. Wait.
It's an invisibility cloak again.
Amir Taki.
Yeah, Amir wrote my foreword. So yeah, I was really trying to impress the establishment and sell books. No, Amir, I mean, he's out there, right? He makes people think, and a lot of people appreciate that. And I was grateful that he took the time to do that when I finally decided to put it on paper and spoke at the conference. We go back to my very beginnings in Bitcoin because I went online. I went online. I knew about Bitcoin, before I got involved, but because of my experience back in the '90s with DigiCash, I was like, another one. Here comes another one. Right? Wasn't really paying attention. I was doing other things, and then I forget what I might have read an article on the Silk Road, I think, and then I was like, oh, I'd take a look at this, and as soon as I looked at it, read the white paper, I got it right away. Immediately dropped everything I was doing, and I got together with my friend Philip, who still works full time on the Bitcoin, and been working on it ever since that day. And first thing I did was I started trying to find some software that I could work on. I found Core, and I looked through the stuff, and I'm like, oh my God, I can't work on this, and I'd have to rewrite the entire thing. And so I eventually found I found NBitcoin, which I think was pretty new at the time.
Yeah,
and
Nicholas Dorier. He was also invited in this podcast. You can check out that episode.
Yeah.
Also, Amir Taki, season 2, episode 2. If you're listening to this, check it out.
Yeah. You get all the good people on here, and so I've met Nick, and I know Amir well. I was an architect at Microsoft, a software architect after I sold them my company, and then
so you coded in C# with Nicholas.
No, it was C++. It was so the company kind of I formed it in the like 97, 96 in my bedroom, doing stuff. It was all early C++ stuff. And then that kind of went through until like 2006 when I sold it. And then when I was at Microsoft, I didn't actually code. I was an architect. So I talked a lot, went to meetings for about 2.5 years. And then I left to rejoin a spin-out company called Beyond Trust that we had created in 2006. And I didn't code for them either. I started doing a third startup, which because it was a server product, I did it in C# and I learned C# then finally, right? So I did know it. I was fairly adept in C sharp. And I looked at and Bitcoin as a result. But because of my experience at Microsoft, the internal analysis at Microsoft of what happened with what was a disaster version of Windows? I can't remember the name of it. Before 2007, before Windows 7.
Vista.
Vista, yeah. So Vista was coming. I joined Microsoft in late 2006, and Vista was a debacle. And the reason it was, I don't know if I should. I don't know what's protected, but I think it's well known that Vista had a lot of issues as a result of .NET C# being put pretty deeply into the operating system, and then it suffering with memory allocation and performance problems because it was managed code. It was a garbage collection environment where you couldn't really control memory, and it was a runtime layer, et cetera, et cetera. So from my experience with that and the way they treated it internally, I decided that I would not, because of the performance characteristics required of Bitcoin, of a node, I didn't want to do it in an interpreted language, in a C# or Java. I didn't want interpreted or a layered language. What's the right word? With a runtime, right? So it wasn't going to be an interpreted script-like thing like JavaScript. It wasn't going to be Java. It wasn't going to. So there was also the Java thing that Mike Kern did, and these things, I call these language ports, right? People took Satoshi's code, his prototype, and just ported it to another language without re-architecting it. So it's, that's a language port. You can fork it off, do like Luke does with
Knots,
right? I think what he does, I mean, I don't monitor too closely, but I think what he does is he takes the new version as it comes out from core, and then he applies his ongoing changes to it. So he's maintaining a fork, is what's that called, right? But it's not a new implementation. So you have language implementations, you have forks, and some forks are alts, but his is not an alt. Obviously, it's just a non-consensus changes, right? So you have alts, which could be forks, like Litecoin was a fork and an alt. You could have a fork that's just, protocol changes or whatever, but not consensus. Or you can have language implementations. But what versions of Bitcoin do not fall into those categories, right? I think Libbitcoin might be the only one. There's Go, there's Rust, there's C#, there's Java, there's sort of Java, there's JavaScript. These are all language ports. They take the same architecture, and now there's probably some re-architecting going on out of necessity, but Amir's goal was not to just do it again in another language. His goal was to do it better from an architectural standpoint and create an independent development group. So the Bitcoin is C++, just like Bitcoin. And we adopted C++ 11 and then 20 well before, Core did. I think Amir adopted level DB before Core did, and then they adopted it and he dumped it and did a, memory mapped IO version. So there's the point is, I don't think there are any other implementations of Bitcoin, at least that are not well known. There might have been some, I think there was somebody that did some re-architecture. It's been a long time now since I've heard about it. But I don't think it was like production quality. It never like shipped a node or anything. And it's really interesting to talk to those people in any of those categories because they understand it at a level that most people cannot. And I had a great conversation with Nick Dory in Tokyo years ago. And it was another kind of core developer there that I don't remember who it was, but it was a great conversation because all of a sudden we're talking about like whether you can validate without really fully having you can validate outputs without having the inputs, under what conditions. And they first were like, no, you can't do that. And then they were like, wait a minute, you can do that. But, and Nick made an observation that was, it showed how deeply he understood what was going on in the code. And it was an important observation because I hadn't made it yet. And anyway, just really, really, really fun to talk to those people. But I don't know. Why were we on this subject again? Now that I'm rambling again.
We're talking about Libbitcoin,
Yeah.
and Yeah, something that I want to mention before I forget is buy crypto economics. Buy this. Eric is not going to say this, but it's possibly the best book written about Bitcoin up to this point. It's better than Mastering Bitcoin in some regards. I think Mastering Bitcoin has some guide like, so
It's
it
more
has
about
some
the technology.
tutorials.
Yeah, it's more about the technology and less about the economics.
But
Yeah.
this one is going to destroy you and your expectations. You're gonna read it, I think your first reaction is gonna be that you disagree with it profoundly, but then it's gonna hit you hard. And it's gonna make you a much better Bitcoiner. It's gonna help you understand how stuff really works and how you mostly understood Bitcoin through narratives. I don't think crypto economics tries to push a narrative. There's no Bitcoin in the name. It's crypto. I mean, this is going to trigger some people already and say, "Oh, we're not going to recommend this book
Just the
because
word
of this."
crypto triggers people. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's very good if you don't want to buy a book, even though I do recommend that you buy it, and you should also buy Crypto Steel and Sato Dime and everything else. But if you don't want to buy it, the CEO of Wasabi Wallet, Max Hillbrand, has read this as an audiobook, and you can find that on Spotify. So look it up, Crypto Economics audiobook. That one is already out there. And thank you for your work, you know. You told me 4 years ago when we did an interview that so I'm trying to recall exactly what you said, but you said that you wrote the articles from this book in time because you were replying to other people's comments and you wanted to have an article out there to explain to them why they're wrong. And you put together a collection of them and you included them in your GitHub. And that's when you realized that you have enough content for a book. And it's a pretty long one. You have like 300 pages, 308 page, no, 313.
Yeah. We get translators did French, Italian, Spanish as well. German is currently there's been like 8 other languages that have been started but not finished, and then German's underway again, and there's some others, but I just kind of help people along if they want to do it. Yeah, I started putting down those wiki posts that are still up there. The whole thing's on the Libbitcoin system wiki. And that was just like you said, I got sick of typing the same stuff over and over again. And finally, I just like, I'm just going to put these here because it was in the software. It's in the Bitcoin repo, right? The software repo. It's just an easy place for me to stick them. So I stuck them there and they're still there. And the entire change history is there. And I'll just post you a link so you can do something with it if you want. And eventually some other people came along and started making PDF. They asked me, can I make a PDF out of this? I'm like, sure, whatever you want. And I think I said, as long as you're giving it away, you're not selling it, that's fine. I still retain the rights to it, but I give it away. That's just because I don't want people changing it and stuff, right? But people, it got to the point where people started making books and trying to use it to teach and stuff like that. And James Chang came along and he made a book out of it. I got a ring bound copy with images and the whole thing. But the problem was at the time I was writing so much that he couldn't keep up with I think I'm putting words in his mouth, but I think it was because I was making so many changes he couldn't keep up, and it kind of got frustrating, and it never got done. And then it was a little while later when I decided to have a conference that I said it would be good to finally finish what he started, and have it. And so I actually got very first printing was a day or two before the conference. It was printed in Hanoi for that. And those remain in Hanoi. And the people that got them at the conference got the original version. And the book is smaller. It's like you can put them side by side. It's quite a bit smaller. Same words pretty much, but so I had to redo the whole thing to get it up on Amazon and and as a Kindle book. But there's probably still, I don't know, maybe 100 original editions sitting in a motorcycle shop in Hanoi. Somebody wants to have them shipped. That'd be nice.
Yeah, the one that I have is printed in Illinois, so it's not the OG
Yep.
copy.
Yep. That's not the original. Yeah, the price in those originals has got to be going up like crazy because there's a very limited supply.
Of course.
I think there's probably less than 50 of them floating around in the world today, except for that supply shock that's in the motorcycle shop waiting to come out.
Yeah, of course. There's an apple on my table. I only took one bite from it, and there's only one of it. It's one of one. It
There's
should be
only
super valuable.
absolutely you're making, Rothbard, believe it or not, in his section on monopoly and man economy of the state makes that almost the exact same argument. There's only one of me. I have a monopoly on my labor. Pay me infinite. I'm like, well, there may be substitutes, right? There's only one Bitcoin, so you're gonna pay, right? Or maybe there's substitutes that called the dollar and everything else. So, all right, lad, how
Thank
we
you very
doing?
much for your time. There are still more questions that you left unanswered. Even a troll who keeps posting stuff and saying that you had a fight with the director of the Cato
Oh
Institute
yeah,
or
yeah.
something.
So let me because this is a new thing. This is like I think this is my first real troll. So this guy, I don't know what his name is. I never met him, I don't think, but he goes by Jay now. He used to be Jolly, whatever. And he's a proponent of the Nash theory, right? That Nash was Satoshi or something like that, right? And I look, we had a lot of lengthy discussions on Twitter that were all public and some private, message ones that I probably still have in my archive. And I finally ended up writing. There's a topic in the book called the ideal money fallacy, because Nash's short paper that he wrote was called Ideal Money, and there's, I guess, people that believe he was off by the feds because he was getting too close to the ideal money thing or whatever. But I looked and tried to find as much information as I could on it, and what I found was it was whatever he may or may not have believed. He wrote very little and said very little. There's just not much there, and so I wrote the ideal money fallacy not based on whether he was or wasn't Satoshi. I don't give a shit. The question was whether the ideas that he did write down and that were presented make sense economically, and they don't. So I wrote that up, and over the years, the guy that's now trolling me has become more and more insistent that I publicly debate him about the thing. Where I've already carried on this debate, wrote topics about it, whatever, and he's written counter blogs, whatever. So I don't, I don't. It's gotten kind of obsessive recently, and I'm wondering what's going on. He actually started posting on all of his trolls that I got a dishonorable discharge from the Navy, and I think this is his way, which I didn't, by the way. I was honorably discharged, and I have the proof. But but this is clearly his way of trying to. I have him muted, so I'll and he knows that, so I think it's his way of trying to goad me into participating more, to give him a stage for this thing. And it's starting to kind of worry me because it sounds a little bit, I'm like mad at the guy. I'm not, don't dislike him. I just, it sounds a little bit unhinged at the point and at the present time, and I'm kind of worried about him. But that's what you're seeing there, unfortunately.
Yep. So I know that your time is scarce and I don't want to take more of it, but in a future episode, if we're going to do another one of these, we still have topics left, and I'm just going to mention them. So Aeon OpsiTV says, out of band mempools, node relay policy, Bitcoin as an economically rational system. And there's also someone in the chat, Jack Kensick, and he says, can you talk about the impacts of changing the proof of work algorithm? I think that can be a nice discussion. And we didn't even talk about the whole Spaceboy situation. I mean, it was such a big deal a few months ago, and then he went away.
Yeah. Yeah. So to me, like, so I ended up engaging with him a bunch of times because, his ideas were just absolute nonsense. And um, I it just like immediately garnered such a huge following. And it was just so, representative of what you see with, like Sailor, right? Like, it just boom, like guy's nobody. And then all of a sudden you see like, oh, it's the savior. I'm like, that's fine as long as you're not driving all the attention and the money away from what we're trying to do. And of course, this whole space boy thing was, I think, I guess people thought he had credibility because he was in the Space Force, right? And he was, whatever, right? So there's no limit to the appeal to authority kind of fallacy. And so I felt like of all the people that work kind of in core development and Bitcoin, kind of economics and stuff, like know anybody else that has like a notable military background. Maybe, you know, I know there's some people that did some time as a couple of years as troops and maybe Israel or whatever, but you know, like nobody really speaks. So I'm like, this guy, the stuff, I checked. He was legit. You know, he was in the. I actually had to check because I'm like, this guy's so full of shit. Is he really actually in the Air Force? So I found some people who knew some people who knew him, and they're like, yeah, he's he's doing his thing. Like, okay, so he's legit. And I felt the need to speak up because people don't understand that world. They don't understand how low level he is, and how little influence he has, and how he's speaking for himself, right? And that these ideas are probably just going to get him, moved into another department and shut down or whatever. But the other thing that was really kind of aggravating to me is that he's going to college on the taxpayer dime, writes his thesis, right, on the taxpayer dime, and then sells it, right, and won't even discuss it with people unless they buy it and read it, right? So I found it really, really off-putting that you could be that arrogant, and I decided it was worth me calling out, like, this is how the U.S. military works, and I don't think they're involved in this. And I think what happened was he was probably told by somebody who maybe read one of my responses who said, "You can't sell that," right? Not that it's illegal, right? Just that the Space Force, which has been widely lampooned by a TV show of the same name, probably doesn't want the bad press. And so that's probably step one. You can't sell that. And probably they said, you need to focus on your job, which is probably tracking space debris from some desk. Go do that, right? But just a funny thing to me was that I think people thought he was an astronaut or something, and like he some celebrity. I'm like, look, this doesn't even have engineering experience with the Air Force. He's, whatever appeal to authority you're making is not legitimate here. He's, and the ideas were just absurd. And I think a lot of people recognize that, and then they recognize the tactics. So anyway, sorry, I thought we were, I know we were ending, but I couldn't resist.
Yeah, it's fun.
Your
So
comments about
if you don't know what Space Boy is about, and I think the best approach is to listen to the Smashing Pumpkins song "Space Boy." That's
Really?
healthier than reading anything.
Buy my thesis.
Don't buy anything except for crypto economics and crypto still using promo code BTC2KBO.
I'm just sitting here looking at my store page, and the orders are just flying in here. You're crazy, man. I'm making so much money.
You're gonna get a Supra soon.
Yeah, all the sales I make in the next 24 hours are going back to you for the Supra.
Yay.
Send me your address.
Thank you.
All right, man.
Okay, thank you very much for your time. It was a very illuminating interview as always. And I think we touched upon lots of interesting topics, from what happened to Bitcoin and some clarifications, and all the way to Saylor and his narratives, and then some technical commentary and some economic commentary. I think I made pretty good use of your knowledge, and those who listened, I hope that they learned something new too. So thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.